Chapter 4 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 4. Shadows of a November twilight are gathering in the two great drawing rooms of the largest house in Portland Place. Rooms that have the grandeur of space and a certain gloomy splendor that has nothing in common with the caprices and elegances of a modern London drawing-room. The furniture is large and massive. There are tables in Florentine mosaic, cabinets of ebony inlaid with ivory, dower chests painted by Paul Veronese or his pupils, the richness of arts that are dead, walls hung with Italian tapestry, the work of cloistered nuns whose fingers have been lying in the dust for 3 centuries, silver lamps suggestive of mortuary chapels. I love the Provana drawing-rooms because they are romantic, and I hate them because they give me the horrors, little Lady Susan Amphlett told people. Romantic was one of her pet words. Her vocabulary was made up of pet words, a jargon of divers tongues, and she used them without mercy. She was very small, very whimsical and pretty, as neat and dainty as a Dresden shepherdess, but she got upon some people's nerves and was occasionally accused of posing, though she was actually as spontaneous as a tropical parasite in a South American forest, a little egotist who thought, spoke, and acted only on the impulse of the moment, and whose mind had no room for the idea of an external world, except as its people and scenery were of consequence to herself. The people she did not know or care about were non-existent. Romantic was her word for Madame Provana. She adored Madame Provana, with whom she had some thin thread of affinity, the kind of distant connection that pervades the peerage and makes it perilous for an outsider to talk of any recent scandal in high life, lest he should fall upon a cousin of the delinquents. Vera and I are connections. Her grandmother was a Disbrowe, Lady Susan told people. But it is not on that account I adore her. I love her because she is romantic, and so few of the people one knows are romantic. If asked where the romance came in, Susan was ready with her reasons. Can there be anything more romantic than the idea of a lovely, ethereal creature who looks as if a zephyr might blow her off her feet, married to an ugly giant whose sole thought and business in this life is to heap up riches, a man who cares for nothing but money, whose brain is a ledger, and whose heart is a cheque-book? Can anything be more romantic when one considers the woman she is and the man he is, and that they absolutely dote upon each other? Provana may dote, someone would say, but I question the lady's feelings. That an impassioned Italian should be fond of a pretty woman, young enough to be his daughter, and whom he married without a penny for the sake of her sweet looks, all the world can understand. But that Madame Provana worships her money merchant is another story. Did not Desdemona dote upon Othello? Cried Susan. At least Provana is not black, and adoration such as his would melt a statue. To be worshipped by a case-hardened money-dealer, a man who trades in millions and holds the sinews of war when nations are spoiling for a fight, a man who is a greater master of finance than half the chancellors of the exchequer who have helped to make history, to see how he worships that child-wife of his, it is absolutely pathetic. Pathetic was the pretty Susie's word for Mario Provana. She used the adjective at the slightest provocation. "You are absolute pathetic," she said, when he brought his wife a necklet of priceless cat's eyes set with brilliants, and handed her the velvet case across the tea-table as carelessly as if it had been a box of bonbons. He was pathetic, impitoyable, stupendo, all the big adjectives in little Lady Susie's vocabulary. Susan Amphlett was Susie, or Lady Susie, for everybody who knew her socially, and for a good many people who had never seen her little minois chiffonné nearer than in a photograph, people who spelled over the society papers in their snug suburban drawing-rooms and loved to follow the flight of those migratory birds, the Mr. and Mrs. Willies and Jimmies and Lady Bettys and Lord Tommies, who were always flitting from branch to branch in the only world that seemed worth living in when one read the society papers, those shiny surfaced, richly illustrated sixpennies, which brought the flavour of that other world across the muffin dishes and savoury sandwiches of suburban tea-tables. Mr. Amphlett was something in the city, or that was his description when people wanted to describe him. He was briefly described as rolling, and yet a pauper, if you weighed him against that mountain of gold, Mario Provana, the international money dealer. If ever Provana goes under, half Europe will have to go under with him, Susie's cousin, Claude Rutherford, ex-guardsman, ex-traveller, ex-artist, ex-lion-shooter, said, when he discussed the great financier with inquisitive outsiders. Claude was in the Portland Place drawing-room this afternoon, lounging against the mantelpiece, near the lamp-lit tea-tables, at one of which Madame Provana presided, his tall, slender figure half lost in a deepening gloom above that island of bright light made by the lamps on the tea-table. It was easy for Claude to be lost in shadow, since there was so little of him to lose. Euclid's definition of a line, length without breadth, was his description, but his slender figure was a line that showed race in every inch. His scientific acquaintance called him a crystallization. Everything that was ever in the Disbrowes and the Rutherfords, good or bad, he has in its quintessence. The poet Eustace Lyons said of him, "Whatever the worst of the Rutherfords or the Disbrowes, from King Stephen downwards, ever did, Claude is capable of doing. Whatever the best of them ever accomplished, he could do if he had a mind to." Unhappily, Claude had a mind to do nothing more with his life than lounge through it in placid idleness. He had done so much with life that it seemed to him that the inconsiderable remnant at his disposal was not enough for action, and so nothing mattered. He had been a soldier, and had seen active service, not without a certain distinction. He had hunted lions and shot harmless elephants with still more distinction. Indeed, in the exploring, lion-annihilating line he had made himself almost a celebrity. He had painted and exhibited pictures that had pleased the public and the critics, and had been told that he might excel in the world of art. But though he loved art, he had not tried to excel. The success of a season satisfied him. Nothing pleased or interested him long. He had no staying power. He painted occasionally to distract himself, but in an amateurish way, and he no longer exhibited. His pictures had not work enough in them to be shown, and indeed rarely went beyond the impression of an hour, but the impression was vivid and vigorous, and always suggested how much the painter might have done if he had cared. He had not long passed the third milestone on the road of life, but he had left off caring for things before his 30th birthday. Languor, light sarcasm, and unfailing good temper were among the qualities that had made him everybody's favourite young man, the very first a smart hostess thought of when she was counting heads for a dinner party. One incentive that has helped some indolent young men to success was wanting in this case. He was not obliged to earn his daily bread. The Rutherfords had coal mines on the Scottish border, and were rich enough to provide for indolent scions of the family tree. 6 or 7 years ago, before he left the army, Claude Rutherford had been an arbiter of fashion among the men of his age. In those days he had taken the business of his outer clothing more seriously than the cultivation of a mind in which fancy had ever predominated over thought. And in those days that element of fancy had entered even into his transactions with tailor and bootmaker, and he had allowed himself some flights of imagination in form and colour. Of all the names given to golden youth, the old-fashioned name of exquisite was the one that fitted Captain Rutherford. It seemed to have been invented for him. He was exquisite in everything, in his habiliments and his surroundings, in speech and manner, in every detail of his butterfly life. But when he left the Grenadiers, to the infinite regret of his brother officers, who were all his fast friends, he flung foppery from him, as it were a cast-off garment; and from the time he worked seriously at his easel, and began to exhibit his pictures, he had become remarkable for the careless grace of clothes that were scrupulously unoriginal, and in the rear rather than in the van of fashion, the sleeves and coat-tails and checks and stripes of the year before last. But he was still exquisite. The grace and the charm were in his own slender form, and not in the stuff that clothed him. He was not handsome. He was not like David, ruddy and fair to see. He had very little colour, and his pale grey eyes were only brilliant in moments of mirth or strong feeling. He had a long, thin nose, and thin, flexible lips, and his mouth, which was supposed to be the Disbrow mouth, and a speciality of that ancient race, was strong in character and expressiveness. His hair was light brown, with a natural wave in that small portion which modern barbers allow to remain on the masculine head. A rippling line above his brow indicated that Claude Rutherford might have been as curly as Absalom if he had let his hair grow. In the afternoon shadows that small head and slim form contrasted curiously with the spacious brow of the tall and commanding figure at the other end of the mantelpiece, the imposing presence of Father Cyprian Hammond, at that time a famous personage in London society, the morals and manners whereof he had of late made it his chief business to satirize and denounce. But the people of pleasure and leisure, the butterflies and humming-birds of the world, the creatures of light and colour, have a keen relish for reproof and denunciation, though they may wince under the lash of irony. For them anything is better than not being talked about. It had been asked of Father Cyprian why he who was so scathing a critic of the follies and general worthlessness of the idle rich was yet not infrequently to be met in their houses. "If I did not go among my flock, I could not put my finger upon the festering spot," he said. "I am a student of humanity. If Lord Avebury could devote his days to watching bees and wasps, do you wonder that I am interested in watching my fellow creatures? A professional beauty affords a noble scope for observation than a queen bee. A gambler on the Stock Exchange offers more points of interest than the industrious ant. If insects are wonderful, is not the man or the woman who hazards eternal bliss for the trivial pleasures of a London season a creature infinitely more incomprehensible? And if, while I watch and listen, I can discover where these creatures are assailable, if I can find some penetrable spot in their armour of pride, I may be able to preach to them with better chance of being heard." Father Cyprian was a conspicuous figure in that crowd of pretty women and nice boys. Tall, even among guardsmen, he held himself like a soldier. He had a fair complexion, light brown hair, and blue eyes, a Saxon of the finest Saxon type, and coming of a family whose genealogical tree had put forth its earliest branches before the Heptarchy. It was the consciousness of superior race, perhaps, that made his fashionable flock tolerant of his stinging denunciation and unmeasured scorn of vice and folly in high places. Everything relating to him was superior. His vestments were superb. His chapel was a thing of beauty. The genius of a Bossuet would hardly have persuaded that world of the successful rich to listen to a withering analysis of its vices and pettinesses from the lips of some little Irish priest, reared in a hovel, and nourished on potatoes and potheen, but it bowed the neck before Father Cyprian's good birth and grand manner. Anglicans who met him in society, mostly in the houses of the powerful or the rich, talked of him as a worldling, but his own flock knew better. They knew that wherever the brilliant Jesuit might be seen, however light his manner or trivial his conversation, one deeply seated purpose was at the back of his mind, the making of proselytes, the aggrandizement of his church, that invincible, indestructible, incomparable, supreme, and unquestionable power to which he had given the service and the devotion of his whole being. If he went much among statesmen and rulers, it was because his church wanted influence. If he cultivated the friendship of millionaires, it was because his church wanted money. For himself he wanted nothing, for he had been born to independence. and though he had given much of his fortune to the necessities of his order, his income was still ample for the only scheme of life that was possible for him. He was not a man who could have lived in sordid surroundings, though he could go down into the nethermost depths of East End poverty, and give his days and nights to carrying the lamp of faith into dark places. He had a refinement of sense that would have made squalor, or even shabby genteel ugliness, unbearable, and he had an ardent and artistic imagination, which made some touch of beauty in his surroundings as needful to him as fresh air and cold water. The attention of both these men, the priest and the man about town, was concentrated upon the lady of the house, who just at this moment was taking very little notice of either of them. She was surrounded by the smartest and prettiest women in the room, chief amongst them Lady Susan Amphlett, who was always to be found near Vera at these friendly tea parties. Vera let Lady Susan and the other women do almost all the talking. She sat looking straight before her, dreamily silent, amidst the animated chatter about trivialities that had ceased to interest her. She was still as delicately slender as she had been 6 years ago at San Marco, when the parsons had called her ethereal, and the spinsters had called her half-starved. But those 6 years had made a transformation, and she was not the same Vera. She had tasted of the tree of knowledge. She had enjoyed all the amusements and excitements that great cities can give to rich and beautiful women. She had been flattered and followed in Rome and Paris and London, had been written about in the New York Herald, had been the fashion everywhere, a person whom not to know was to confess oneself as knowing nobody and going nowhere. Indeed, it was a kind of confession of outsiderism not to be able to talk of Madame Provana as Vera. She had accepted the position with a kind of languid acquiescence, taking all things for granted after the first year, when everything amused her. In this 6th year of marriage and wealth without limit, she was tired of everything except the society of authors and painters and actors and musicians, the people who appealed to her imagination. She had inherited from her father the yearning for things that earth cannot give, the au-delà, the light that never was on sea or land, the glory and the dream. She admired and respected Father Cyprian Hammond, and she liked him to talk to her, though she could divine that steadfast purpose at the back of his head, the determination to bring her into the papal fold. She argued with him from her Anglican standpoint, and pleaded for that via media that might reconcile old things with new, and she felt the weakness of her struggle against that skilled dialectician, but she refused to be converted. Half the pleasure of her intimacy with this eagle of Monk Street would be lost if she surrendered, and had to exchange the struggle for the attitude of passive submission. His arguments sometimes went near to convincing her, but the faith he offered did not satisfy those vague longings for the something beyond. It was too simple, too matter-of-fact to arrest her imagination. It offered little more than she had already in the ritual of her own church. The change did not seem worth while. She looked up suddenly in the midst of the silvery treble talk about theatres and frocks. "Claude, do you ever keep a promise?" she asked. "Always, I hope." "You promised to bring Mr. Symeon to see me." "Did I?" "Indeed you did, ages ago." "Ages?" "Well, nearly 3 weeks. It was at the Hellstones' dinner." 3 weeks. Mr. Symeon is not at the call of the first comer." There was a little cry from the women, who had left off talking in order to listen. "He calls Madame Provana the first comer," exclaimed the youngest and pertest of the circle. "I call myself the first comer where Symeon is concerned. I am not one of his initiated. I belong to the outer herd of wretches who eat butcher's meat and attach importance to dinner. Mr. Symeon condescends when he gives me half an hour of a life that is spent mostly in the clouds." "I would give worlds to know him," said Lady Susan. "I have taken his quarterly, The Unseen, from the beginning. His articles upon the spiritual life are adorable, but I am not conceited enough to pretend to understand him." "If people understood him, he would be less admired," said Rutherford. "What does he do?" asked the youngest and flippantest. I am always hearing of Mr. Symeon and his spook magazine, but what does he do? Is it thought reading, slate writing, materialization? Does he float up to the ceiling as Home did? My granny swears she saw him, yes, positively floating in that large house by the Marble Arch." "Mr. Symeon does nothing," replied Claude. "He is the high priest of the transcendental. He talks." "How disappointing!" "Most people find that enough." "They are bored?" "No, they are fascinated. Mr. Symeon is more magnetic than Gladstone was. He must have stolen those green eyes of his from a mermaid. His disciples get nothing but his eyes and his talk, and they believe in him as Orientals believe in Buddha. I've heard people say he is Buddha, Gautama's latest incarnation." "That's rather lovely," exclaimed Miss Flippant. "I would give worlds to see him." "We'll excuse you the worlds, even if you own them," said Claude in his lazy voice. "You may see him within the next 10 minutes, unless he is a promise breaker. I had not forgotten your commands, Vera. I spent half a day in hunting Symeon, and did not leave him till he promised to come to tea with you. I believe tea is the most material refreshment he takes." "You are ever so much better than I thought you," said Vera, with one look up at Rutherford, before she turned to gaze at the distant door, heedless of the talk that went on round her, until, after some minutes, a servant announced Mr. Symeon. Claude Rutherford left his station by the mantelpiece and went to meet the visitor. The spacious rooms were mostly in shadow by this time, all the lamps being so tempered by artistic shades in sea green silk that they gave faint patches of colour rather than light, and some people started at the sound of Mr. Symeon's name, almost as if they had seen a ghost. It was a name that all cultured people knew, even when they did not know the man. Francis Symeon was a leader in the spiritual world, and there were no depths in the mysteries of occultism, from ancient Egypt to modern India, that he had not sounded. He was the editor and proprietor of The Unseen, a quarterly magazine to which only the most advanced thinkers were allowed to contribute, a magazine which the subscriber opened with a thrill of anticipation, wondering what new revelation of the life beyond was to find in those shining hot-pressed pages, where the matter was often more dazzling than the gloss on the paper. Vera watched with eager interest and a faint flush of pleasure as Rutherford and Symeon came through the shadows towards her. "You see, I've kept my promise, and here is Mr. Symeon to answer some of those far-reaching questions with which you often bewilder my poor brain." Vera left her table, where there had come a sudden lull in the soprano voices as Mr. Symeon drew near, a pause in the discussion of frocks and hats in the new comedy at the St. James's. She stood up to talk to Mr. Symeon, telling him how she had been reading the last number of The Unseen, and more especially his own contribution, an essay on the other life, as understood by Tennyson and Browning. In that half-light which makes all beautiful things more beautiful, she had a spirit look, and might have seemed the materialization of Mr. Symeon's thought, as she stood before him, fragile and slender, with glimmering lamplight on her cloud of brown hair, and on the simple white gown of some transparent fabric loosely draped over satin that flashed through its fleecy whiteness. Her only ornament was a necklace of aqua marina in a Tiffany setting. "She wears that thing when she wants to look like a mermaid," Miss Pert whispered to her pal. "No, she wears it to remind us that she has some of the finest jewels in London, and that she despises them," said the pal, who had reached that critical age which is described as getting on, and was inclined to take a sour view of a young woman who had married millions. Symeon and Vera talked for some time, she with a suppressed eagerness, earnest, almost impassioned; Symeon grave and reserved, yet obviously interested. "We cannot talk of these things in a crowd," he said. "If I had known you had a party—" "It is not a party. People come every afternoon in the winter, when there is not much for them to do. But if you will be so kind as to come early some day, at 3 o'clock, for instance, I will not be at home to anybody, unless it were Claude, who loves to hear you talk." "I will come to-morrow," said Symeon, and then with briefest adieu he walked slowly through the crowd, acknowledging the greetings of a few intimates with a distant bend of his iron grey head, and walking amongst the pretty faces and smart frocks as he might have done through so many sparrows pecking on a lawn. Lady Susan came to Vera, excited and eager. "Why didn't you keep him? I wanted you to introduce him to me. I have been pining to know him. I read every line of his review. He is wonderful. I believe he has secrets that ward off age. You must ask me to meet him at luncheon, a party of 4, with Claude. Claude has been horrid about him." "I value his friendship too much to introduce him to Tom, Dick, and Harry," said Claude. "Vera and he are elective affinities." Father Cyprian and Claude Rutherford left the house together. "May I walk with you as far as your lodgings?" Claude asked. "By all means, and come in with me if you can. It is early yet, and I have long wanted a talk with you." "Serious?" "Yes, even serious. When one cares as much for a young man as I do for you, there is always room for seriousness. You look alarmed, but there's no occasion. I don't preach long sermons, especially not to young men." They walked to the end of the street in silence. They were old friends, and though Claude was the most lax among papists, Cyprian Hammond had never lost hope of bringing him back to the fold. He was emotional and imaginative, and he had a heart. Sooner or later there would come a day when he would want the utmost the Church could do for him. "You can't wonder if I am a little afraid," Claude said presently. "There has been some hard hitting from your pulpit within the last year." "You have heard my moralities? I won't call them sermons." "Yes, I have heard, but I doubt if I have enjoyed your diatribes as much as the other sinners, especially the women of your flock. They love to be told they are a shade worse than Semiramis, if you will only imply that they are as fascinating as Cleopatra." "Poor worms," said the priest with a long-drawn sigh. "They are such very poor creatures. Even their sins are petty." "Would you prefer them if they were poisoners like the Borgia?" "No, but I might despise them less, and I should have more hope of their repentance. These creatures don't know they are sinners. They gamble, they squander their husbands' fortunes, shipwreck their sons' inheritance, and when the domestic ship goes down, they are injured innocents, surprised to find that things are so expensive. I have talked with them, not in the confessional, and I have sounded the shallows of their silly minds. There are no depths, unless it were a depth of self-love. They come to Mass, and sit fanning themselves and sniffing eau de Cologne, while I expostulate with them and try to turn their thoughts into new channels. And then they get tired of the creed in which they were brought up, tired of hearing hard things, and of tasting wormwood instead of honey." "Is modern London so like Babylon?" "I doubt if the city with 100 gates was much worse. And your substitutes for the Church you have deserted, your Christian Science, pragmatism, humanism, your letters from the dead, your philanthropy expressed in oranges and buns for workhouse children and in fashionable bazaars, charities that overlap each other and pauperize more than they relieve, and all for want of that one tremendous central power that could harmonize every effort, bring every man and woman's work into line and rule. In the history of God's chosen people, the one unpardonable sin was the worship of strange gods. Their Creator knew that religion was the only basis of conduct, and that the worshippers of evil gods must themselves become infamous. But this is the age of strange gods. You all have your groves and high places, your Baal and Ashtart, your Kali or your Shiva, your shrines upon mountain tops and under green trees, your Buddha, your Nietzsche, your Spinoza, your Comte. You run after the teachers of fantastic things, the high priests of materialism. You worship anywhere but in your church. You believe anything but the faith of your forefathers." They were at Father Cyprian's door by this time, in one of those wide streets west of Portland Place and north of the world of fashion, streets that may still be described as quiet, save for the ceaseless roar of traffic in the Marylebone Road, a sound diminished by distance, the ebb and flow of life in an artery of the great city. It was in a street parallel with this that the great cardinal who defied the law of England had lived and died half a century before. They had been walking slowly through the thickening mist of a fine November evening, a grey vapour across which street lamps and lighted windows glimmered in faint flashes of gold, an atmosphere that Claude Rutherford loved, all the more perhaps because he had never been able to satisfy himself in painting it. "What is the good of trying when one must always fall short of Turner?" he had said to himself in those younger and more eager days when he still tried to do things. Father Cyprian had talked with a kind of suppressed passion as they walked through solitary streets, and now he laughed lightly as he turned the key in his door. "You have had the sermon after all," he said. "It didn't touch me. I am not an extravagant bridge-playing woman, and I worship no strange god." "I shall touch you presently. Your withers are not unwrung." "Suppose I say good night and give you the slip?" "You won't do that. I was your father's friend." That was enough. Claude bent his head a little, as if at a sacred name, and followed the priest up the uncarpeted stone staircase to a large room on the first floor, the conventional London drawing-room, with its 3 long windows and chilling white linen blinds. But, except the shape of the room and the white blinds, there was nothing to offend the eye that looked for beauty. The floor was cheaply covered with sea-blue felt, which echoed the colouring of the sea-blue walls, and the central space was occupied by a massive knee-hole desk of ebony, inlaid with ivory, evidently of Italian workmanship, and picturesque enough to please without being a chef d'oeuvre. There were only 2 objects of art in the spacious room, but each was supreme after its kind. A carved ivory crucifix of considerable size, mounted on black velvet, was centred on the wall facing the windows, and over the marble mantelpiece there hung a Holy Family by Fra Angelico. These, which were exquisite, were the only ornaments that Father Cyprian had given himself in his 10 years' residence in this house, where this spacious sitting-room, with a large bedroom for himself and a small room for his servant, comprised all his accommodation. 6 high-backed armchairs covered with old stamped leather, and a massive gate-legged table, black with age, on which he dined, completed his furniture. To some visitors the sparsely furnished room might have seemed cold and cheerless, but there was an air of repose in its simplicity that satisfied the artistic mind. It looked like a room designed for prayer and meditation, not a room for study, for the one bookcase with its neat range of theological works would not have sufficed for the poorest student. It looked like a room meant for solitude and thought, and for only the most serious, the most confidential conversation. "I have always a sense of rest when I come into this room," Rutherford said, while Father Cyprian was lighting the candles in a bronze candelabrum on his desk. "You should come here oftener, Claude. You might make a retreat here once or twice a week. Sit on the bank for a few hours, and let that tumultuous river of modern life go by you, while you think of the land where there is no tumult, only a divine repose, or an agony of regret. When did you make your last confession, Claude?" "I have a bad memory, Father. Don't tax it too severely." The priest was not to be satisfied by a flippant answer. He pressed the question with authority. "What have I to confess? An empty, dissatisfied soul, a useless life, no positive wickedness, only negative worthlessness." "I am not an infidel," Claude added eagerly. "If I were an unbeliever, I would not presume to claim your friendship. I should think it an insolence to cross your threshold. I have been slack. I have fallen into a languid acceptance of my own shortcomings." "You have fallen in love with another man's wife," said the priest gravely. "That is the name of your sin." The thin face paled ever so slightly, but there was no indignant protest. Indeed, the head drooped a little, as if the sinner had whispered mea culpa. "I have never made love to her," he said in a low voice, "but I am human, and can't help loving her." You can help going to her house. You can help hanging over her as she sits among her friends. When it comes to making love, the Rubicon is passed, and the chances of retreat are as 1 in 50. You are on the downward slope, Claude. Every time you enter that house, you go there at the hazard of your soul. She has so few real friends. She is alone among a crowd. She and I were friends as children, or at least when she was a child. I should be a cur if I kept away from her when she needs my friendship, just because of the risk to myself. I am too fond of her ever to hazard a situation that would mean danger for her. I know how much a woman in her position has to lose. She is not the kind of woman who could pass through the furnace of the divorce court and hold up her head and be happy afterwards. She is a creature of spirit, not of flesh. Passion would never make amends to her for shame. Yet, knowing this, you make yourself her intimate companion. I shall never betray myself. She will never know what you know. For her, I am a feather-brained amateur of life, interested in many things, caring for nothing, a saunterer through the world, without much heart and without any serious purpose. She often scolds me for my frivolity. I admit that she has a certain childlike innocence which might keep her unconscious of your feelings till the fatal moment in which you will fling principle, prudence, honour to the winds and declare yourself her lover. That moment will never come. The day I feel myself in danger, I shall leave her for ever. In the meantime, if I am essential to her happiness, I shall stop. How can you be essential? She has crowds of friends, and a husband who adores her. A husband of 50 years of age, grave, silent, with his mind concentrated upon international finance, a man who is thinking of another Turkish loan while he sits opposite her with his stony eyes fixed upon space, a man whose brain is a calculating machine and his heart a handful of ashes. Has she complained of him? Never. But things have leaked out. She was not 18, little more than a child, when she married him. She gave herself to him in a romantic impulse, admiring his force of character, her heart touched by his affection for a dying daughter. To be so loved by that strong nature seemed to her enough for happiness. But that was 6 years ago, and she has lived 6 years in the world. The romance has gone out of her love. What can she have in common with such a man? The bond of marriage, his love, and her sense of duty, answered the priest. She has a keen sense of a wife's duty. She preaches sermons upon her husband's goodness of heart, his fine character, and she ends with a sigh, and regrets that for some mysterious reason she has not been able to make him happy. She is too rich and too much indulged, and she is without a saving creed. Poor child, I would give much to save her from herself and from you. Don't be afraid of me, father. Men of my stamp may be trusted. We are too feather-brained to be intense, even in sin. Good night. I hear the jingle of glass and silver, and I think it must be near your dinner time. Good night. The priest gave him his hand, but not his blessing. That was withheld for a better moment. End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 5. When a woman's imagination, still young and ardent, begins to find the things of earth as Hamlet found them, weary, flat, stale, and unprofitable, it is only natural that she should turn with a longing mind to the life that earth cannot give, the something unseen and mysterious that certain gifted individuals have attributed to themselves the power of seeing. Vera, after 6 years of marriage, 6 years of unlimited wealth and unconscious self-indulgence, had begun to discover that most things were stale, and some things weary, and all things unprofitable. And then, to a mind steeped in modern poetry and modern romance, and the modern music that always means something more than mere combinations of harmonious sounds, there had come a yearning for the higher life, the transcendental life that only the elect can realize, and only the earth-weary can ardently desire. Francis Symeon was the philosopher to whom she turned with unquestioning faith, for even those who had spoken lightly of his creed and of his reasoning faculty had admitted that the man was essentially sincere, and that the faith he offered his followers was for him as impregnable as the rock of Holy Scripture. He was announced on the following day as the clock in Vera's morning room struck 3, a punctuality so exceptional as to seem almost uncanny, when compared with the vague sense of time in the rest of her acquaintance. She received him in a room where there was no fear of interruption, her sanctuary, more library than boudoir, where the books she loved, her poets and novelists and philosophers, in the bindings she had herself invented, filled her bookcases, alternating with black and white portraits of the gods of her idolatry: Browning, Tennyson, Byron, Scott, de Musset, Heine, Henry Irving, Gounod. Only the dead had place there, the dead musician, the dead poet, the dead actor. It was death that made them beloved and longed for. They had gone from her reach forever, and it was this sense of something forever lost that made them adorable. Mr. Symeon looked round the walls with evident admiration. "I see you prefer the faces of the noble dead to watercolour sketches and majolica plates," he said. "Divine books, divine faces, those are the best companions a woman can have." "I spent a good deal of my life in this room," Vera answered. "I have no children. I suppose if I had, I should spend most of my time with them. I should not have to choose my companions among the dead." "You have chosen them among the living," Mr. Symeon answered in a voice that thrilled her. "Do you think that Tennyson is dead? He who knew that the whole question of religion hinges upon the afterlife, immortality, or a godless universe. Or Browning, who has gone to the very core of religion, whose magnificent mind grasps the highest and deepest in divine love and divine power? Such spirits are unquenchable. This rag of mortality upon which they hang must lie in the dust, but for the elect death is only the release of the immaterial from the material, the escape of the butterfly from the worm. You have the assurance from the lips of Christ. God is the God of the living, and for those whose existence on earth is only the apprenticeship to immortality, there is no such thing as death." This was the chief article in Mr. Symeon's creed, hinted at, but not formally stated, in his contributions to the magazine which he edited. He claimed immortality only for the elect, for those in whom the spirit predominated over the flesh. To Vera, there was no new idea in his exposition of faith. She had a feeling that she had always known this, from the time she stood beside Shelley's grave in the shadow of the Roman cenotaph, and that other grave under the hill, the resting place of Shelley's Adonais. The thought of corruption had been far from her mind, albeit she knew that the heart of one poet and the wasted form of the other were lying in the darkness below those spring flowers on which her tears were falling, and it was no surprise to her to hear a serious man of 60 years of age declare his faith in the unbroken chain of life. "I saw that you were not one of those who scoff at transcendental truths," Mr. Symeon said, after a few minutes' silence. "I read in your eyes last night that you are one of us in spirit, though you may know nothing of our creed. You must join our society." "Your society?" "Yes, Madame Provana. We are a company of friends in the world of sense and in the world of spirit. The majority of us have crossed the river. As corporal substance they have ceased to be. Their dwelling is in the starlight spaces beyond Acheron. For the common herd they are dead. but for us they are as vividly alive as they were when they walked among the vulgar living and wore life's vesture of clay. They are nearer to us since they have passed the gulf, and we understand them as we never could while they wore the livery of earth. They are our close companions. The veil that parted us is rent, and we see them face to face. Vera listened in silence, and the grave, slow speech went on without a break. We have our meetings, we discuss the great problems, the everlasting mysteries, we press forward to the higher life. We are not afraid of being foolish, romantic, illogical. We are prepared for contempt and incredulity from the outside world. But for us, whose minds have received the light from those other minds, who have been consoled in our sorrows, strengthened in our faith by those influencing souls, there is nothing more difficult in our creed than in that of Newman, who saw behind each form of material beauty the light, the flower, the living presence of an angel. The spirits of the illustrious dead are our angels, and our communion with them is the joy of our lives. We called ourselves simply us. Our chosen poets, philosophers, painters, musicians, even the great actors of the past, those ardent spirits in whom genius was unquenchable by death, men and women whose minds were fire, and their corporal existence of no account in the forces of their being, those who have lived by the spirit and not by the flesh, all these are of our company. These are the influencing souls who are our companions in the silence and seclusion of our lives, not by the trumpery expedient of an alphabet rapped upon a table, or by the writing of an unguided pencil, but by the communion of spirit with spirit. We feel those other minds in converse with our own. They teach, they exhort, they uplift us to their spirit world, sometimes in hours of meditation, and sometimes in the closer communion of dreams. "Are their voices heard? Do they speak to you?" Vera asked, deeply moved, her own voice trembling a little. "Only in dreams. Speech is material, and belongs to the earthly machine. It is not from lip to ear, but from mind to mind that the message comes." "And do they appear to you? Do you see them as they were on earth?" Vera asked. The November twilight had filled the room with shadow, and the face of the spiritualist, the sharply cut features and hollow cheeks and luminous grey green eyes, looked like the face of a ghost. "Only in dreams is it given to us to look upon the disembodied great. We feel and we know. That is enough. But in some rare cases, where the earthly vesture has worn to its thinnest tissue, where death has set its seat upon the living, to one so divested of mortal attributes, so marked for the spirit world, the vision may be granted. Such an one may see." "You have known?" faltered Vera. "Yes, I knew such a case. In the final hour of an ebbing life the chain of wedded love that death had broken was reunited, and the wife died with her last long gaze turned to the vision of her husband. Her last word was 'reunited.'" Vera was strangely impressed. It was not easy for the unbelieving to make a mock of Mr. Symeon's creed. The force of his convictions, the ideas that he had cultivated and brooded upon for the larger part of his life, had so possessed the man, that even scoffers were sometimes moved by his absolute sincerity, and found themselves, as it were unawares, treating his theories almost seriously. For Vera, in whom imagination was the greater part of mind, there was no inclination to scoff, but rather a most earnest desire that the spiritualist's creed might be justified by her own experience, that it might be granted to her to sit in the melancholy solitude of that room, with a volume of Browning on her lap, and to feel that the poet was near her, that an invisible spirit was breathing enlightenment into her mind, as she read the dying words of the beloved apostle in A Death in the Desert. which had been to her as a new gospel, and to know that when she raised her eyes to the portrait on the wall, it was not dead, but the living upon whom she looked. This was involved in the creed of her church, the communion of saints. Were not the gifted, who had lived free from all the grossness of clay, from the taint of earthly sin, worthy to be numbered among the saints, and like them gifted with perpetual life, perpetual fellowship with the faithful who adored them? When he left the great silent house, Mr. Symeon knew that he had made a proselyte. Though Vera had said little, it was impossible to mistake the fervour with which she had welcomed his revelation of the spirit world. Here was a mind in want of new interests, a heart yearning for something that the world could not give. She sat by the dying fire, in the gathering darkness, long after her visitor had left her. Yes, this had been her need of late, something to think of, something to wish for. Her life, so overfull of the things that women desire, pomp and luxury, troops of friends, jewels and fine clothes, the too much that money always brings with it, had vacant spaces and hours of vague depression, in which the sense of loneliness became an aching pain. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Matt Ferrard. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 6. Mario Provana's wife was the fashion, the prestige for which some women strive and labor for years, spending themselves and their husbands' fortunes in the strenuous endeavor, and having to confess themselves failures at last, had been won by Vera without an effort. Her husband's wealth had done much. Her youth, and the something rare and exceptional in her beauty, had done more. But the Disbrowes had done the most of all. With such material, a triple millionaire's wife, in the first bloom of her loveliness, the work had been easy. But no one could deny that the Disbrowes had worked, and might fairly congratulate themselves, as well as their fair young cousin, first, second, or third, as the case might be, upon the result of their tactful efforts. All Disbrowes were supposed to have tact, just as they had arched insteps and long, lean hands. It was as much a mark of their race. From the day of Vera's return from her long Italian honeymoon, she found herself walled round and protected by her mother's kindred. They came from all the points of the compass. Lord Okehampton from his park in North Devon, Lady Balgowrie from her castle in Aberdeenshire, Lady Helstone from the Land's End. They came unbidden, and overflowing with affection, but much too tactful to be vulgarly demonstrative. Poor Lady Felicia's foolish pride kept us all at a distance, they told Vera. But now that you are emancipated and your own mistress, I hope you will let us be useful. From countesses down to hard-up spinsters, they all said the same thing, and no one could accuse them of gush. They all announced themselves as worldlings, pure and simple, and they made no professions. "You have made a great match, my dear," said Lady Helstone, "and you have a great career before you, if you are careful in the choice of your friends. That is the essential point. One black sheep among your flock might spoil all your chances. There are men about town that my husband calls oilers. They were called tigers when my mother was young, and one of those in a new woman's visiting list can wreck her. The creatures are intolerably pushing, and don't resist till they can pose as cavaliers servants, or at least as l'ami de la maison." Vera welcomed this army of blood relations with amiability, but without enthusiasm. She was ready to love that one kind lady who had given her the only happy holiday of her childhood, under whose hospitable roof she had known Claude Rutherford. But the countesses who had been unaware of her existence while she was a dependent upon poor Lady Felicia could have no claim upon her affection. Yet they and their belongings were all pleasant people, and in that large and splendid house, which was to be her home in London, she found that people were wanted. The emptiness of those spacious rooms during the long hours when her husband was at his offices in the city, soon became appalling, and she was glad of the lively aunts and cousins, and their following, who transformed her drawing rooms into a parrot house, both for noise and brilliant colour, to say nothing of the aquiline beaks that prevailed among the dowagers and elderly bachelors. Once established as her relations, the distance of some of the cousinship being ignored, they came as often as Vera cared to ask them, and they brought all the people whom Vera ought to know, the poets and novelists and playwrights who were all dying to know the daughter of Lancelot Davis, that delightful poet whom everybody loved and nobody envied. His fame had increased since he had gone into the ground, and his shade was now crowned with that belated fame which is the aureola of the dead. They brought the newest painting people and the fashionable actors and actresses, English or American, as well as that useful following of nice boys who are as necessary in every drawing room as occasional chairs or tables to hold teacups. Instigated by the Disbrowes and with Mario Provana's approval, Vera soon began that grand business of entertaining, to which a triple millionaire's wife should indubitably devote the greater part of her time, talent, and energy. Countesses and countess dowagers gave their mornings to her, advising whom she should invite, and how she should entertain. They instructed her in the table of precedence as solemnly as if it had been the church catechism, showing her how, in some rare concatenation, a rule might be broken, as a past master of harmony might, on occasion, allow himself the use of consecutive fifths. They were never tired of extending Madame Provana's knowledge of life as it is lived in the London that is bounded on the south by Queen Anne's Gate and by Portland Place on the north. They called it opening her mind, and praised her for the intelligence with which she mastered the social problems. Her husband was pleased to see her admired and cherished, above all to see her happy, yet he could not but feel some touch of disappointment when he looked back upon those quiet afternoons in the olive woods at San Marco, and the tea parties of three in Lady Felicia's sitting room, and remembered how he had thought he was marrying a friendless and unappreciated girl, who would be all the world to him, and for whom he must be all the world, in a long future of wedded love. He thought he was marrying a friendless orphan, whose divine inheritance was poetry and beauty, and he found that he had married the Disbrowes. They were all terribly friendly. They never hinted at his inferior social status, his vulgar level as a tradesman, only trading in money instead of goods. They behaved as if, by marrying their cousin, he had become a Disbrowe. Lady Helstone, Lady Balgowrie, Lord and Lady Okehampton treated him with affection without arrière-pensée. The most that Okehampton, as a man of the world, wanted from the great financier was his advice about the investment of his paltry surplus, so trifling an amount that he blushed to allude to the desire in such exalted company. But now a time had come when Vera needed no counsel from the Disbrowes, and when she was beginning to treat those social obligations about which she, as a tyro, had laboured diligently, with a royal carelessness. Her aunts complained that she had grown casual, and that she had even gone very near offending some of their particular friends, people whom to have on her visiting list ought to have been the crown of her life. Vera apologized. "I know far too many people," she said. "My house is becoming a caravanserai." She said "my house" unconsciously, with the deep‐seated knowledge that all those splendid rooms and the splendid crowds that filled them meant very little in her husband's life. 6 years of the too much had changed Lady Felicia's granddaughter. The things that money can buy had ceased to charm. The people whom in her first season she had thought it a privilege to know had sunk into the dismal category of bores. Almost everybody was a bore, except a few men of letters who had known her father, or who loved his verses. For those she had always a welcome, and she was proud when they told her that she was her father's daughter. Her eyes, her voice were his, these enthusiasts told her. She was a creature of fire and light, as he was. After 3 or 4 years of pleasure in trivial things, she had grown disdainful of all delights, except those of the mind and the imagination. The opera or the theatre, when Shakespeare was acted, always charmed her. But for the olla podrida of music and nonsense that most people cared for, she had nothing but scorn. She never missed a fine concert or a picture show, but she broke half her engagements to evening parties, or appeared for a quarter of an hour and vanished before her hostess had time to introduce the new arrivals, American or Continental, who were dying to know her. The general impression was that she gave herself airs, but they were airs that harmonized with her fragile beauty, the something ethereal that distinguished her from other women. If any stout, florid creature were to behave like Madame Provana, she would be cut dead, people told Vera's familiar friend, Lady Susan Amphlett. Lady Susan pleaded her friend's frail constitution as an excuse for casual behavior. "She is all nerves and suffers agonies from ennui. Her father was consumptive, and her mother was a fragile creature who faded away after 3 years of a happy married life. It was a marriage of romance and beauty. Davis and his wife were both lovely, but they had no stamina. Vera has no stamina." Lady Felicia had been lying more than a year in the family vault in Warwickshire. Her last years had been the most prosperous and comfortable years of her life, and the vision of the future that had smiled upon her in the golden light above the jutting cliff of Bordighera had been amply realized by the unmeasured liberality of her granddaughter's husband. Before Vera's honeymoon was over, the shabby lodgings in the dull, unlovely street had been exchanged for a spacious flat in a red brick skyscraper overlooking Regent's Park. Large windows, lofty ceilings, a southern aspect, and the very newest note in decoration and upholstery had replaced the sunless drawing room and the Philistine walnut furniture, and for those last years the Disbrowe clan ceased to talk of Captain Cunningham's widow as poor Lady Felicia. What more could any woman want of wealth than to be able to draw upon the purse of a triple millionaire? As everything in Lady Felicia's former surroundings, her shifting camp of nearly 20 years had been marked with the broad arrow of poverty. Every detail of this richly feathered nest of her old age bore the stamp of riches, and the Disbrowes, who knew the price of things, could see that Mario Provana had treated his wife's relation with princely generosity. Once more Lady Felicia's diamonds, those last relics of her youth, to which she had held through all her necessitous years, were to be met in the houses of the fashionable and the great, and Lady Felicia herself, in a sumptuous velvet gown, silvery hair dressed by a fashionable artist, emerged from retirement in a perfect state of preservation, having the advantage by a decade of giddy dowagers who had never missed a season. The giddy dowagers looked at her through their face main and laughed about Lady Felicia's resurrection. "She looks as if she had been kept in cotton wool and put to bed at 10 o'clock every night," they said. Granny enjoyed that Indian summer of her life, and was grateful. "You have married a prince," she told Vera, "and if you ever slight him or behave badly, you will deserve to come to a bad end." Vera protested that she knew her husband's value and was not ungrateful. "I want to make him happy," she said. "That is easy enough," retorted Granny. "You have only to love him as he deserves to be loved." Was that so easy? Vera wondered sadly. It seemed to her that, by no fault of hers, there had come a difference in her relations with her husband. He was always kind to her, but he was farther from her than in the first year, the Italian year, which to look back upon was still the happiest of her married life. He was absorbed in a business that needed strenuous labor and unflagging care. He had told her that it was not his own interests alone that he had to guard, but the interests of other people. There were thousands of helpless people who would suffer by his loss of fortune or his loss of prestige. The pinnacle upon which the house of Provana stood was the strong rock of a multitude. A certain anxiety was therefore inevitable throughout his business life. He could never be the holiday husband, sharing all a wife's trivial pleasures, interested in all the nothings that make the sum of an idle woman's existence. Vera accepted the inevitable, and it was only when she began to think the best people rather boring that she discovered how the distance had widened between herself and her husband. Without a dissentient word, without a single angry look, they had come to be one of those essentially modern couples whose loveless unions Father Cyprian deplored. She thought the blame was with Mario Provana. He had ceased to care for her. Just as she had grown weary of her troops of friends, her husband had wearied of the wife he had chosen after a week's courtship. "He thought he was in love, but he could not really have cared for me," she told herself. "His heart was empty and desolate after the loss of his daughter, and he took me because I was young and had been Julia's friend." This was how Vera reasoned, sitting in her lonely sanctuary, while on the other side of the wall there was a man of mature age, a man with a proud temper and a passionate heart, a man who had endured slights in his youth, whose first marriage had ended in disappointment. The crushing discovery that the beautiful girl who had been given to him by a noble and needy father had sacrificed her inclinations for the sake of her family and had never loved him. She had been faithful, and she had endured his love. That was all. And in those last years, when disease had laid a withering hand upon her beauty, and when the world seemed far off, and when only her husband's love stood between her and death, she had learnt the value of a good man's devotion, and had loved him a little in return. He had suffered the disillusions of that first union. Yet again, after many years, he had staked his happiness upon a single chance, and had taken a girl of 18 to his heart, in a state of exaltation that was more like a dream than sober reality. He had lavished upon this unsophisticated girl all the force of strong feelings long held in check. At last, in the maturity of manhood, the love that had been denied to his youth was being given to him in full measure. He could not doubt that she loved him. That innocent, unconscious love, trusting as the love of children, revealed itself in tones and looks that he could not mistake. Before he asked her to be his wife, he was sure that she loved him. But after 6 years of marriage he was no longer sure of anything, except that his wife was the fashion, and that her Disbrowe relations were innumerable. He was sure of nothing about this girl whom he had clasped to his breast in a rapture of triumphant love on the hill above the Mediterranean. Year after year of their married life had carried her farther away from him. Who could say precisely what made the separation? He only knew that the years which should have tightened the bond had loosened it, and that he could no longer recognize his child wife of their Roman honeymoon in the fragile Ennuyée whom society had chosen to adore. End of chapter 6. Chapter 9 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 7. "Well, now your whim has been gratified, I should like to know what you think of Francis Symeon?" Claude Rutherford asked, as he put down his hat in Vera's sanctum, the day after her conference with the high priest of occultism. The question was his only greeting. He slipped into the low and spacious chair by the hearth and seemed to lose himself in it while he waited for a reply. He had the air of being perfectly at home in the room, with no idea that he could possibly be unwelcome. He came and went in Madame Provana's house with a lazy insouciance that many people would have taken for indifference. Only the skilled reader of men would have detected the hidden fire under that outward serenity of the attractive man who flirts with any attractive woman of his acquaintance, and cares for none. "I think he is wonderful." "And you believe in him?" "Yes, I believe in him, because his ideas only give form and substance to the thoughts that have haunted me ever since I began to think." "Grisly thoughts?" "No, Claude, happy thoughts. When I first read my father's poetry and began to think about him, in my dull grey room in Grannie's lodgings, I had a feeling that he was near me. He was there, but behind the veil. When I read 'In Memoriam' the feeling grew stronger, and I knew that death is not the end of love. There was nothing that shocked or startled me in what Mr. Symeon told me yesterday." "About us, the spiritual club in which the dead and the living are members on the same footing? The club that elects or selects Confucius or Browning one day, and Lady Fanny Ransom, Mad Lady Fanny as they call her, the next?" "I saw nothing to ridicule in a companionship of lofty minds. But you know more about the society than I do. Perhaps you are a member?" Claude answered first with a light gay laugh, and then in his most languid voice: "Not I. I am of the earth earthy, sensual, sinful. If I went to one of their meetings I should have to go disguised as a poodle. Lady Fanny owns a fine Russian, that has a look of Mephisto, though I believe he is purely canine." "Tell me all you know about their meetings." "Imagine a Quakers' meeting, with the female members in Parisian frocks and hats. A large room at the back of Symeon's chambers in the Albany. It was once a fashionable editor's library, smelling of Russia leather, and gay with Zandor's bindings. But it is now the abode of a shadow, where glowing embers through the room teach light to counterfeit a gloom. And there the congregation sits in melancholy silence till somebody, Lady Fanny or another, begins to say things that have been borne in upon her from Shakespeare or Browning or Marlowe or Schopenhauer, or her favorite bishop, if she is pious. They wait for inspiration as the Quakers do. I am told Lady F. is tremendous. She is strong upon politics and is frankly socialistic. She has communications from Karl Marx and Fourier, George Eliot and Comte. Her inspiration takes the widest range and moves her to the wildest speech. But she is greatly admired. They never have a blank day when she is there." "I should like to hear her. I know she is eccentric, but she is immensely clever, and she seems to have read everything worth reading, in half a dozen languages." "She crams her expansive brain with the best books, but I am told she occasionally puts them in upside down, and the author's views came out topsy turvy. You are of imagination all compact, Vera, but I should be sorry to see you lapsing into Fannytude." "You scoff at everything. There is nothing serious for you in this world or the next." "Which next world? There are so many. Symeon's, for instance, and Father Hammond's. What could be more diverse than those? I have thought very little about the undiscovered country. But you must not say I am not serious about something in this world." "I cannot imagine what that something is." "I hope you will never know. In fact, you are never to know." His earnestness startled her. When a man's dominant note is persiflage, any touch of grave feeling is impressive. Vera was silent, and they sat opposite each other for a few moments, she watching the rise and fall of a blue flame in the heap of logs, he watching her face as the blue light flashed upon it for an instant and then left it dark. It was a face worth watching. She had her mermaid look this evening, and her eyes, ordinarily dark gray, looked as green as her sea water necklace. "How is Provana?" he asked at last, an automatic question indicating faintest interest in the answer. "Oh, he is very well, but I am afraid he is worried. He stays longer in the city than he used to stay, and he is very grave and silent when we dine alone." "What would you do if the great house of Provana were to go down like a scuttled ship? Would you stick to a bankrupt husband, renounce London and all its pomps and vanities, give up this wilderness of a house and all the splendid things in it?" "Can you suppose the loss of money would change my feeling for him? If you can think that, you must think I married him because he was rich." "And didn't you?" "I hate you for the question. When Mario asked me to be his wife, I had not a thought of his wealth. I knew that he was a good man, and I was proud of his love." "But you were not in love with him." "I don't know what you mean. I loved him for his noble character. I was proud of his love." "That is not being in love, Vera. A woman who is in love does not care a jot for her lover's character. She loves him all the better, perhaps, because he is a scoundrel, the last of the last, the off-scouring. There were women in Rome who doted upon Caesar Borgia, women who knew that he was a poisoner. Take my word for it. You liked Provana because he was your first lover, and you were tired of a year in year out tête-à-tête with Granny." "You know nothing about it. If he were to lose his fortune tomorrow, I think I should be rather glad. We could live in Italy. Poverty would bring us nearer together, as we were in our honeymoon year. We should have plenty to live upon with my settlement." She rose and moved towards the door. "It is nearly 5, and there will be people coming," she said. The door opened as she spoke, and Lady Susan Amphlett looked in. "Aren't you coming, Vera? There is a mob already, and people want their tea. What are you two talking about, entre chien et loup? You look as weird as Mr. Symeon, Claude." "We were talking of Symeon when Vera began to worry about the people downstairs, who are not half so interesting." "I should think not. Mr. Symeon is thrilling. To know him is like what it must have been to be intimate with Simon Forman or Dr. Dee. I would give worlds to belong to his society. It is quite the smart thing to do. The members give themselves no end of airs in a quiet way." Lady Susan would have stood in the doorway talking in her crisp and rapid way for a quarter of an hour, oblivious of the people in the drawing room. But Vera slipped a hand through her arm, and they went downstairs together, Susan talking all the way. "Fanny Ransom has just come in, with her girl. Not out yet, but ages old in knowing what she oughtn't to know. How can a woman like Fanny, eaten up with spiritualism, look after a daughter? They say she went to Paris last winter on purpose to attend a black mass." "The not out daughter?" asked Claude. "No, the mother. But she told the girl all about it, and the minx raves about the devil, and says she would rather be initiated than presented next year." "Lady Fanny had better take care, or she will be expelled from us. I don't think Symeon would approve of the Black Mass. His philosophy is all light. Light and darkness are his good and evil." Claude spoke in an undertone, as they were in the room by this time, but he ran small risk of being overheard in a place where everybody seemed to be talking and nobody listening. Lady Fanny was the center of a group, her large brown eyes flashing, her voice the loudest, a tall, commanding figure in a black and gold gown, and a black beaver hat with long ostrich feathers and a diamond buckle, a hat that suggested Rupert of the Rhine rather than a modern matron. Her girl stood a little way off, with 3 other not outs, listening to her mother's balderdash with unsuppressed mockery. "Isn't she too killing?" this dutiful child exclaimed, in a rapture of contemptuous amusement. and then she and her satellites bounced down upon the most luxurious ottoman within reach, and employed themselves in disparaging criticism of the company generally, their dress, demeanour, and social status, with much whispering and giggling, happily unobserved by grown ups, who all had their own interesting subjects to talk about. Lady Fanny was deserted in favour of Vera, who, at the tea table, became the focus of everybody's attention. At the beginning she had taken a childish pleasure in pouring out tea for her friends, rejoicing in the exquisite china, the old world silver, glittering in the blue light of the spirit lamps, the flowers, and the beauteous surroundings. So different from the scanty treasures of shabby gentility, the dented silver, worn thin with long use, the relics of a Swansea tea service with many a crack and rivet, to which her youth had been restricted. She performed the office automatically, nowadays, oppressed with the languor that hangs over those who are tired of everything, most especially the luxury and beauty they once longed for. One can understand that in the reign of our Hanoverian kings it was just this state of mind which made the wits and beauties eager for a window over against Newgate to see a row of murdering pirates hanging against the morning sky. Nothing could be too ghastly or grim for exhausted souls in want of sensation. The afternoon droppers in had long become a weariness to Madame Provana. Yet as her fashion had depended much upon her accessibility, she could not have shut her door upon people who considered themselves obliging when they used her drawing room as a rather superior club. Claude Rutherford slipped out of the room imperceptibly, eluding the people who wanted to talk to him with the agility of a vanishing harlequin. He had another visit to pay before his evening engagements, an almost daily visit. There was just one person in the world for whom he, who had left off caring for people or things, was known to care very much. In expatiating upon the blemishes in an agreeable young man's character, people often concluded with: "But he is a model son. He adores that old woman in Palace Place." It was to the old woman in Palace Place that Claude was going this November afternoon, and walking briskly through the clear, cold grey, he knew as well what the old woman was doing as if he had been gifted with second sight. She was sitting in her large, low chair, with her table and exquisite little tea service, his gift, at her elbow, and with her eyes fixed on the dial of the Sevres clock on the mantelpiece, while her heart beat in time to the ticking of the seconds, and he knew that if he were but 10 minutes later than usual those minutes were long enough for the maternal mind to visualize every form of accident that can happen to a young man about town. Nobody talked of poor Mrs. Rutherford, or pitied her widowed solitude, as they had pitied Lady Felicia. The fact that she had her own house in a fashionable quarter and a handsome income made all the difference. The house was not spacious, but it was old, an Adams house, and one of the prettiest in London, for whatever had been done to it after Adams had been done with taste and discretion. Much of the furniture was of the same date as the house, and all that was more recent was precious after its kind, and had been bought when precious things were easier to buy than they are now. And Mrs. Rutherford was as perfect as her surroundings, a slim, pale woman, dressed in black, and wearing the same widow's cap which she had put on in sorrow and anguish 15 years before, and which harmonized well with the long oval face and banded brown hair, lightly streaked with grey. She was a quiet person, and entertained few visitors except those of her own blood, or connections by marriage. But the name of those being legion, nobody called her inhospitable. Altogether she was a mother whom no well-bred son need be ashamed of loving. Once, upon his friend saying something to this effect, Claude had turned upon the man fiercely. "I should have loved her as well if she had been a beggar in the streets, and had hung about the doors of public houses with me in her arms. To me she is not Mrs. Rutherford, but just the sweetest, tenderest mother on this earth, and she would have been the same if fate had made her a beggar." You believe that in your fantastic fits, but you know it ain't true," said his friend. Mrs. Rutherford looked up with a radiant face when her son entered the room. She had heard his light step on the stair. He had a latch key, and there was no other sound to announce his coming. "Am I late, mother?" "It is 8 minutes past 5." "And you have been watching the clock instead of taking your tea." The butler entered with a teapot as he spoke, having made the tea immediately upon hearing the hall door open. "What have you been doing with yourself this afternoon, dearest?" Mrs. Rutherford asked, looking up at him fondly as he stood with his back to the mantelpiece, looking down at her. "Loafing, as usual. I looked in at the new gallery. Their winter show began today. Half a dozen grand things, the rest croûte." "And then?" she asked gently, seeming sure there would be something else. "Then I walked up Regent Street. It was a fine bracing afternoon, from the gallery to the Langham and along Portland Place." "And you had tea with Vera Provana?" "No, not tea. There is no tea worth tasting out of this room. There was a mob as usual at the Provanas', and I slipped away." "Was Signor Provana there?" "Not he. He was last heard of in Vienna, but I believe he is coming home next week." "An unsatisfactory husband for a young thing like Vera," said Mrs. Rutherford, with a faint cloud on her thoughtful face. Claude knew that look of vague trouble. It was often on his mother's forehead when she spoke of Vera. "I don't think women ought to call him unsatisfactory. He is the most indulgent husband I know. He adores his wife, and she reigns like a queen in that great house of his, and in their Roman villa." "That kind of indulgence is a dangerous thing for a young woman, especially if she is capricious and full of strange fancies." "Poor little Vera! You don't seem to have a high opinion of her." "I don't want to be unkind. She has passed through an ordeal that only a woman of high principles and strong brain can pass without deterioration. A girlhood of poverty and deprivation, under close surveillance, and a married life of inordinate luxury and liberty. She was married at 18, remember, Claude, before her character could be formed. Nor was Lady Felicia the person to lay the foundation of a fine character. One ought not to speak ill of the dead, but poor Felicia was sadly trivial and worldly minded." "Madre mia, what a sermon! If you think poor little Vera is in danger, why don't you contrive to see a little more of her? She would love to have you for a real friend. She has a host of acquaintances, but not too many friends. Susan Amphlett is devoted to her, but Lady Susie is not a tower of strength." "I believe they suit each other. They are both feather headed, and both poseuses." At this Claude fired and was almost fierce. "Vera is no poseuse," he said. "She is utterly without self consciousness. I don't think she knows that she is lovely, in spite of the society papers. Fortunately, she has no time to read them. She is too absorbed in her poets, Browning, Shakespeare, Dante. I doubt if she reads a page of prose in a day." "And is not that a pose?" "Her idea is to be different from other women, a creature of imagination, in the world, but not of it. That is what people say of Madame Provana. So charming, so different." "She can't help what people say, any more than she can help looking more like Undine than a woman whose clothes come from the Rue de la Paix." Mrs. Rutherford let the subject drop. She did not want to bring unhappiness into the sweetest hour of her life, the hour her son gave her. And she knew she could not talk of Vera without the risk of unhappiness. He who was the joy of her life was also the cause of much sorrow. But from the day he left the army, under some kind of cloud, never fully understood, but divined, by his mother, she had never let him know what a disappointment his broken career had been to her. She was a soldier's daughter, and a soldier's widow, and to be distinguished as a leader of men was to her mind almost the only way to greatness. Yet she had smiled when this cherished son had made light of military fame, and told her he would rather be another Millais than another Arthur Wellesley. She had expressed no regret, a few years later, When he told her that art was of all professions the most hateful, and that he did not mean to follow up the flashy success of his early pictures. "They might make me an associate next year, if my work was a little better," he told her. "But I am not good enough to hit the public taste 2 years running. It was the subject or the devilry in my picture that caught on. I might never catch on again. And I'm sick of it all, the critics, the dealers, and the whole brotherhood of art." There again his road in life came to a dead stop. But this time it was not a wicked woman's form that barred the vista and shut out the temple of fame. As he had missed being a great soldier, he was to miss being a famous painter. Though the men who knew, the men who had already arrived, had told his mother that a brilliant career might have been his, if he had chosen to work for it. To work, not by fits and starts, like a fine gentleman in a picturesque painting room, but as Reynolds had worked, and Etty and Wilkie, when he sat on the floor painting, with his own legs for his subject. Again, after trying her powers of persuasion, and trying to fire his ambition, Mrs. Rutherford had resigned herself to disappointment, and had been neither reproachful nor lugubrious. She was an ambitious woman, and her son had disappointed her ambition. She was a deeply religious woman, and she saw her son indifferent to his religion, if not an unbeliever. And she never persecuted him with tears or remonstrances, only on rare occasions, and with the utmost delicacy, pleading the urgency of a strong faith in the midst of a faithless generation, and the deadly risk the man runs who neglects the sacraments of his church. Although she did not often approach this subject in her talk with Claude, it was not the less a subject of anxious thought, and she replied upon the influence of her old and devoted friend, Father Cyprian Hammond, rather than her own, for the saving of her son's soul. If a good woman's prayers could have guarded his path and kept him from temptation, Claude Rutherford would have walked between guardian angels. End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Sarah in Brighton. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 8, Part 1. While Claude Rutherford's peril was a subject of troubled thought for his mother and her friend and father confessor Cyprian Hammond, no friendly voice had breathed words of warning into Vera's ear, nor had she any consciousness that warning was needed or that danger threatened. Claude was part of her life, from the day when she had met him for the first time after her marriage at a luncheon party at Lady Okehampton's, and they two had sat talking in the embrasure of a window, recalling delicious memories of her childhood's once happy holiday, the ponies, the dogs, the gardens, the woods, the beach and sea, all the joy of his kindness had created for her in that verdant paradise upon that summer's sea. From that happy hour when they had sat talking, while Lady Okehampton waited with growing displeasure for an unpunctual dowager duchess, she had felt that this kinsman of hers belonged to her, that to him she might look as the guide, philosopher, and friend indispensable to the happiness of every woman whose husband is occupied with serious interests and has a mind above trivialities. There was nothing too trivial for Claude to understand and discuss with interest. The merest nothing would command his serious thought, if it were something that interested Vera, nor was any flight of her fancy too wild or too high for him, from the colour of a frock or the shape of a hat to the most oracular utterance of Zarathustra. She could command his attention and counsel. He came and went in her house like the idle wind, and his entrances and exits were no more considered than the wind. When her particular friends asked her whether she had seen Mr. Rutherford lately, she would shrug her shoulders and smile. "My cousin Claude? Yes, he was here yesterday. I see him almost every day." If he has nothing better to do, he comes in after his morning ride and sometimes stays for luncheon. People were not unkind, but as years went on, the situation was taken for granted, and there were quiet smiles, gently significant, when Madame Provana and her cousin were talked about. Their relations were accepted as one of those open secrets, not to know which is not to be in society. Lady Susan did her best to establish the scandal by telling people that Vera and Claude had been brought up together, or almost, and that their attachment was the most innocent and prettiest thing imaginable, like Paul and Virginia, a classic which Lady Susan had never read. The almost was necessary, as most people knew that Vera had been brought up by Lady Felicia in furnished lodgings and had hardly had a second frock to her back, to say nothing of being underfed, which early privation was the cause of the pale slenderness that some people called ethereal. Lady Susan's friends, furthermore, being well up in Burke, were satirical about the link of kindred between third and fifth cousins. Yet on the whole there was indulgence, and when Vera went on a week-end visit to the seats of the mighty, she generally found Mr. Rutherford one of the party, which was hardly a cause for wonder, since he was of the stuff of which week-end parties are made. Vera was more than innocent. She was unconscious of anything particular in her friendship for his friend of her childhood. What could be more natural than that she should love to talk of that one blissful interval in her dull existence, the solitary oasis in the desert of genteel poverty? Only then had she known the beauty of woods and gardens. Only then had she known what summer could mean to the emancipated child, the rapture of riding over dancing waves in a cockleshell of a boat, with the warm wind blowing her hair, and the seagulls flashing their white wings overhead, the adorable birds whose name was Legion. To talk of those young days and to feel again as she had felt then was a delight which only Claude could give her, and the more hollow and unsatisfying things that money could buy became to her, the more she loved to sit with her locked hands upon her knee and talk of that unforgotten holiday. Do you remember that evening I asked you to row me out to the setting sun, right into the great golden ball, and you said you would, and you went too far, and we were out till after dark, and everybody was frightened and then angry. All their talk began with, "Do you remember?" His memory was better than hers, and he recalled adventures and moments that she had forgotten. One day he brought her a little sketch on thick cardboard, roughly painted in oils, one of his early bits of impressionism before he had studied art. A little girl in a short white frock, with hair flying about her, cheeks like roses, and the blue of the sea in her eyes. What a funny child! You didn't mean that for me? For no one else. I have dozens of such daubs. You remember how I used to sit on a rock and paint while you were looking for shells or worrying the jellyfish? Poor things! I wanted to see them move. I hope they had no feelings. Yes, you used to sit and paint, and I thought you disagreeable because you would not play with me. Beyond these pictures of the past, they had inexhaustible subjects for talk. There was a whole world of literature, the literature of decadence, in which Vera had to be initiated, and Claude was a past master in that particular phase of intellectual life. Baudelaire, Verlaine, Nietzsche, the literature of pessimism and the literature of despair, that rebellion against law, human and divine, which Shelley began, and which had been a dominant note among young poets since the revolt of Islam, filled romantic minds with wonder and a vague delight. Imperceptibly, naturally, and in no manner wrongfully, as it seemed to Vera, Claude Rutherford's society had become essential to her happiness. She accepted the fact as placidly and with as complete confidence in him and in herself as if such a friendship between an idle young man and an imaginative young woman had never been known to end in shame and sorrow. She had lived in the world half a dozen years, and had known of many social tragedies, but as these had not touched any friend she valued, and as she was not a scandal lover, Those dark stories of husbands betrayed and nurseries abandoned had never deeply impressed her, and had been speedily forgotten. Nobody, not even Lady Susie, who was a mauvaise langue, had ever hinted at impropriety in her association with her cousin. Signor Provana saw him come and go, and asked no questions. That stern and lofty nature was of the kind that is not jealous. Had there been no Iago, Cassio might have come and gone freely in the noble Moor's household, and no shadow of fear would have darkened that great love. Vera's husband was a disappointed man. His dream of a young and loving wife who would make up to him for all that he had missed in boyhood and youth had melted into thin air. He was sensitive and proud, and the memory of his unloved childhood and of his first wife's indifference was never absent from his mind when he considered his relations with his second wife. He thought of his age, he saw his stern, rough features in the glass, and a faint touch of coldness, the fretful weariness of an overindulged girl, was taken for aversion, and all his pride and all his force of character rose up against the creature he loved too well to judge wisely. It was he who built the wall that parted them. It was his gloomy distrust of himself rather than of Vera that made the gulf between them. Let her be happy in her own way. He had sworn to make her happy, and if it was her nature to delight in trivial things, if the aimless existence of a rich man's sultana was her idea of bliss, she would reign sole mistress of a harem which he never would enter while he believed himself unwelcome there. Vera accepted this gradual drifting apart as something inevitable, for which she was not to blame. The strong man's impassioned love, which had appealed to the romantic side of her character, had languished and died with the passing years. She brooded on the change with sorrowful wonder before she became accustomed to the idea that the lover who had taken her to his heart with a cry of ineffable rapture had ceased to exist in the grave man of business, whose preoccupied manner and absent gaze, as of one looking at things far away, chilled her when she sat opposite him on those rare occasions when they dined tête-à-tête, occasions when the dinner table was only a glittering spot in the dark spaciousness of the room, a world of shadows, where the footmen moved like ghosts in the area between the table and the far-off sideboard. They had been married 6 years, but Vera thought sadly that her husband looked 20 years older than the companion by whose side she had climbed the mule paths through the lemon orchards and olive woods of San Marco, the man whose conversation had always interested her, her first friend, her first lover. She accepted the change as inevitable, having been taught by the wives of her acquaintance to believe that marriage was the death of love, and as gradual as she learned to dispense with her husband's society, so guiltlessly, because unconsciously, she came to depend upon Claude Rutherford for sympathy and companionship. She did not know that she loved him, though she knew that the day when they did not meet seemed a long drawn-out weariness, and that when the evening shadows came, they brought a sense of desolation and a strange lassitude, as of one weighed down by intolerable burdens. All occupations and all amusements were burdens if Claude was not sharing them, society the heaviest of all. Far easier to endure the dreary day in the solitude of her den, with the faces of her beloved dead looking at her, than among empty-headed people who could only talk of what other empty-headed people were doing, or were going to do, with that light spice of malice that makes other people's mistakes and misfortunes so piquant and interesting. Claude Rutherford had become a part of her life, and life was meaningless without him, a fatal stage in the downhill path. But it was a long time before her awakened conscience gave the first note of warning. Then, waking in the first faint flush of a summer dawn, after a night of troubled sleep and feverish dreams, a night succeeding one of those dismal days that she had been obliged to endure without the sight of the familiar face, the glad, gay call of the familiar voice, the sound of the light footstep on the stairs, she told herself for the first time with unutterable horror that this man was dearer to her than he ought to be, dearer than her husband, dearer than her peace of mind, dearer than all this world had held for her, and all the next world promised. Oh, the wickedness of it! The shame! The horror! To be false to him, the man who had put his strong arms round her and lifted her out of the dismal swamp of shabby gentility and taken her to his generous heart, the man who trusted her with unquestioning faith, who had never by word or look betrayed the faintest doubt of her truth and purity. No lover's word had been spoken, no lover's lips had met, yet as she rose from that uneasy bed and paced the spacious room in fever and agitation, a ghostly figure with bare feet and streaming hair and long white draperies, she felt as if she were steeped to the lips in dishonour, a monster of ingratitude and treachery. And then she began the struggle that most women make, even the weaker souls, when they feel the downward path sloping under their feet, and know that the pit of shame lies at the bottom of it. Though they cannot see it yet, the impotent struggle in which all the odds are against them, their environment, every circumstance of their lives, their friends, the nearest and dearest even, to whom they cannot cry aloud and say, "Don't you see that I am fighting the tempter? Don't you see that I am halfway down the hill and am trying to make a stand, that I am over the edge of the cliff and hanging to the bushes with bleeding, lacerated hands, in the desperate endeavour to keep myself from falling? Have you neither eyes nor understanding that you don't try to help me?" Rarely is any friendly hand stretched out to help the woman who sees her danger and tries to escape her doom. Acquaintances look on and smile. These open secrets are accepted as part of the scheme of the universe, a particular phase of existence that doesn't matter as long as the chief actors are happy. The wife, her familiar friend, her complacent or indifferent husband are smiled upon by a society of men and women who know their world and take it for what it is worth. Only when the actors begin to play their parts badly, when the open secret becomes an open scandal, does society cease to be kind. Vera did not think of society in that tragic hour of an awakened conscience. That which would have been the first thought with most women had no place in her mind. It was of her sin that she thought, the sin of inconstancy, of ingratitude, of faithlessness. Had she crossed the border line and qualified herself for the divorce court, she could not have thought of herself with deeper contrition. To love this other man better than she loved her husband, to long for his coming, to be happy when he was with her and miserable when he was away, there was the sin. But no word of love had been spoken. There was time for repentance. He did not know that she loved him, although looking back and recalling words and tones of his, she could not doubt that he loved her. She could hope that no word of hers had revealed the passion, whose development had been gradual and imperceptible as the growth of leaf buds in early spring, which no eye marks till they flash into life in the first warmth of April. Her friendship with this man, who was her kindred, the companion of the only happy days of her childhood, had seemed as natural as it would have been to attach herself to a brother with whom she had long been separated. She had welcomed him with a childish eagerness. She had trusted him with a childish belief in the perfection of the creature who is kind. She admired him, comparing him with all the other young men she knew, and finding him infinitely above them. His very weakness had appealed to her. All that was wanting in his character made him more likeable, since compassion and regret mingled with her liking. To be so clever, so gifted by nature, and to have done nothing with nature's gifts, to be doomed to go down to death, leaving his name written in waters, to die having finished nothing but his beaux jours. People who liked him best talked to him as a young man with a beau passé. Shoulders were shrugged and smiles were sad when his painter friends discussed him. We thought he was going to do great things in art, and he has done nothing. Soldiers who remembered him before he left the army lamented the loss of a man who was made for a soldier. There had been trouble about a woman that had made him exchange to a line regiment. And then, the war being over and the chance of active service remote, disgust had come upon him, and he had done with soldiering. Vera had seen the shoulders shrugged, had heard the deprecating criticism of his kinsman of hers, and had been all the kinder to him because fate had been cruel. She had tried to fire him with new hope. She had been ambitious for him, had steeped herself in art books and spent her mornings in picture galleries in order that she might be able to talk to him. She had implored him to go back to his work, to paint better pictures than he had painted when critics prophesied a future for his work. "I'm too old," he said. "Nonsense, you have wasted a few years, but you will have to work harder and buy back your lost time. Quentin Matisse did not begin to paint till he was older than you." There were giants in those days. Compared with such men, I am an invertebrate pygmy. Oh, if you loved art, you would not be content to live without the joy of it. Yes, that's what people look at pictures think, the joy of painting, a thing like that. The man who paints knows when the disgust comes in and the joy goes out. He knows the sense of failure, the disappointment, the longing to fling his half-finished picture on the floor and perform the devil's dance upon it, as Müller used to do. And then one day, as they were going round a picture gallery together, he said, "Well, Vera, I've been meditating on your lecture, and I'm going to paint another picture. The last, perhaps." "No, it won't be the last. I am going to paint your portrait. After all that sermonizing, you can't refuse to sit to me." "I won't refuse, unless Mario should object." "How should he object? He will be in New York, or Madrid, or Constantinople, most likely, while I am painting you. I am nothing if not impressionist, so it mustn't be a long business." "I shall love sitting to see you at work." "Yes, to see me earning my bread in the sweat of my brow like the day labourer will be a novelty. I shouldn't want to be paid for the picture, but I dare say Provana would insist upon my taking a fee, and as he counts in thousands, it would be a handsome one. No, Vera, don't blush. I won't take money for my daub. You should give it to the Canine Defence League. It shall be a labour of love, a concession to a sermonizing cousin. I shall paint your portrait just to convince you that I can't paint, and that the life I am wasting is worth nothing." Thus, in light talk and laughter, the plan was made that brought them into a closer intimacy than they had known before, and although Claude Rutherford was an impressionist, that portrait was 3 months upon the easel, which he had rigged up in Vera's morning room. "I want to paint you in the room where you live, not with a marble pillar and a crimson curtain for a background." The sittings went on at irregular intervals, in a style that was at once sauntering and spasmodic. All through that season, Signor Provana looked in now and then, stood watching the painter at work for 5 or 10 minutes, criticised, and made a sudden exit, driven away by Lady Susan's shrill chatter. But Lady Susan was not always there, and there were more tranquil hours when Vera sat in her half-reclining attitude on a low sofa spread with a tiger skin, fanning herself with a great fan of peacock feathers, and gazing at the pictures on the wall with dreaming eyes, hours in which the painter and his subject talked by fits and starts, with silent pauses. After all the pains that had been taken, the picture was a failure. The painter hated it. Provana frankly disapproved, and in the haggard, large-eyed siren smiling over the edge of the fan, Vera could not recognise the face she saw in the glass. "I've been much too long over the thing," Claude told Provana, with slow and languid speech, half indifference, half disgust, "and it is a dismal failure. But I shall do better next time, if Vera will let me make a rapid sketch of her when the daffodils are in bloom and we shall be week-ending at Marlow Chase. I could make a picture of her on the hill above the house, in the yellow afternoon light and among the yellow flowers. I am an open-air painter if I am anything, but I had almost forgotten how to set a palette. I shall work in a friend's studio in the autumn, and I may do better next year." Vera urged him to persevere in this good intention, and not to mind his failure. "I mind nothing," he said. "I have had 3 happy months. I mind nothing while you are kind, and forgive me for having put you to a lot of trouble with his atrocious daub for the outcome of it all. Privileged people only were allowed to see the daub, but those, although supposed to be few, in the end proved to be many. Critics were among them, and Mr. Rutherford was too shrewd not to discover that every connoisseur had a little hole to pick in the portrait, and that when all the little holes were put together there was nothing left. And this picture, so poor a thing that it was as it was made the beginning of that open secret which everybody knew long before the awakening of Vera's conscience. And while Mario Provana saw nothing to suspect or to fear in his wife's intimacy with her cousin. But now, with the awakening of conscience, began the fight against fate, the fight of the weak against the strong, the woman against the man, innocent youth against an experienced lover. She was single-hearted and pure in intention, counting happiness as thistledown against gold, when weighed against her honour as a wife. But she entered the lists without knowing the strength of her opponent, the passive force of a weak man's selfishness. The main purpose of her life was henceforward to release herself from the web that had been woven so easily, so imperceptibly. First, a careless association between two people whose likings and ideas were in harmony, then friendship, confidence, sympathy, and then unavowed love, love that made the days desolate when the lovers were not together. He had been too frequent and too dear a companion. He had become the master of her life, and it was for her to release herself with that unholy bondage. She had to learn to live without him. It needed more than common cleverness and tact to bring about a change in their manner of life, without making a direct appeal to Rutherford's honour and telling him that their friendship had become a danger. To do this would be to tell him that she loved him, to confess her weakness before he had passed the borderline that divides the friend from the lover. No, she could make no appeal to the man whose smouldering fires she feared to kindle into flame. She knew that he loved her, and that he had made her love him. She had to escape from the web that he had woven round her, and she had, if possible, to set herself free without his knowing the strength of her purpose or the desperate nature of the struggle. All the chances were against her. She could not forbid him in the house without an open scandal. As he had come and gone in the last 4 years, he must still be free to come and go. She could only avoid those familiar hours that had been so dear, by living in a perpetual restlessness, always finding some engagement away from home. It was dreary work, but she persevered and enlisted all the Disbrowes in her cause, unconscious that they were being made use of. She accepted every invitation, lent herself to everybody's fads, philanthropic or otherwise, listened to the same fiddlers and singers day after day, in drawing rooms and among people that she knew by heart, or stood with aching head under a 10-guinea hat, selling programmes at amateur theatricals. She contracted a closer alliance with the Lady Susan Amplet, and planned excursions, a day at Windsor, a day at Dorking, at Guildford, to rummage in furniture shops at Greenwich, to see the Nelson relics, to Richmond and Hampton, even to Kew Gardens. Lady Susan was almost worn out by these simple pleasures, but as she professed and sincerely an absolute cult for Veera Davis, she held out bravely. These excursions were fairly successful, and as Veera took care that no one should know where she and her friend were going, not even Susan till they were on the road, it was not possible for Claude to follow her. It was otherwise in the houses of her friends, where she was always meeting him, and where it was essential that she should not seem to avoid him, least of all to let him see she was doing so. She greeted him always with the old friendliness, and a little more cousinly than it had been of late, and she showed a matronly interest in his health and occupations, as if she had been an aunt rather than a cousin. "It is quite delightful to meet you here this afternoon," he told her, in a ducal house where guinea tickets for a charity concert seemed cheap to the outside public. "You are to be met anywhere and everywhere except in your own house. I have called so often that I have taken a disgust for your knockers. When I am dead, I believe those lions' heads will be found engraven on my heart like Queen Mary's Calais." It was only natural that, with the awakening of conscience, that there should come the thought of those 2 first years of her married life, when her husband's love had made an atmosphere of happiness around her, when she had cared for no other companion, needed no other friend, those blessed years before Claude Rutherford's pale, clear-cut face and low, seductive voice had become a part of her life, essential to her peace. The change of feeling, the growing regard for this man, had come about so gradually, with a growth so slow and imperceptible, that she tried in vain to analyse her feelings in those 4 years of careless intimacy, and to trace the process by which an innocent friendship had changed to a guilty love. When had the fatal change begun? She could not tell. It was only when she felt the misery of one long day of parting that she knew her sin. The husband had become a stranger. The friend had become the other half of her soul. He had called her by that sweet name sometimes, but with so playful a tone that the impassioned phrase had not scared her. It was one of many lightly spoken phrases that she had heard as carelessly as they were uttered. And now, looking back at the last 2 years, she told herself that it was her husband's fault that she had lent on Claude for sympathy, her husband's fault that they had been too much together. For some reason that she had never fathomed, Mario Provano had held himself aloof from the old domestic intimacy. It was not only that his business engagements necessitated his absence from home several times in the course of the year, and on occasion for a considerable period. He had business in Russia and in Austria, and he had crossed the Atlantic twice in the last year, the affairs of his New York house calling for special attention in a disturbed state of American finance. These frequent absences alone were sufficient to weaken the marriage bond, but in the last year he had given his wife very little of his society when they were under the same roof. "You have hosts of friends," he said one day, when she was reproaching him for keeping aloof. "People who share your tastes and can be amused by the things that amuse you. I bring back a tired brain after my continental journeys, and am still more tired after New York. I shall make a wretched companion for a young wife, a beautiful butterfly who was born to shine among all the other butterflies." "I am nearly as tired as you are after your business journeys, Mario," she said. "I shall be very glad when we go back to Rome." "But you will have other butterflies there, and a good many of the same that flutter about you here," he answered. "We will shut our doors upon them and live quietly, like Darby and Joan, old Darby and young Joan. No, Vera, we won't try that. You weren't made for the part." She had been too proud to say more. If he was tired of her, if he had ceased to care for her, she would not ask him why. But now, in her desperate need, sick to death of those aimless excursions and unamusing amusements with Lady Susan, and of the dire necessity of keeping away from her own house to flutter from party to party, almost sure of meeting Claude wherever she went, she turned in her extremity to her natural protector and tried to find shelter in the love that ought to be her strong rock. End of chapter 8, part 1. Recording by Sarah in Brighton. Chapter 8 of Beyond These Voices. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Sarah in Brighton. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 8, Part 2. Her husband had been on the continent, moving from city to city for the greater part of the June month, in which she had been making her poor little fight against fate, trying to cure herself of Claude Rutherford as if he had been a bad habit, like drink or drugs. And then one morning, when she was beginning the day dejectedly, tired of yesterday, hopeless of tomorrow, a telegram from Paris told her to expect her husband at 7 o'clock that evening. Her heart beat gladly, as at the coming of a deliverer. She was not afraid of meeting him. She longed for his coming, as the one friend who might save her from an influence that she feared. The face she saw in the glass while her maid was dressing her hair almost startled her. There were dark marks under the eyes, and the cheeks were hollow and deadly pale. The black gauze dinner gown she had chosen would accentuate her pallor. But it was nearly 7 o'clock, and there was no time for any change in her toilet. She paced the great empty rooms in sun and shadow, listening to every sound in the street, and wondering if her husband would see the sickening change that sickening thoughts had made in her face, and question her too closely. She heard the hall door open, and then the familiar footstep, rapid, strong, and yet light, very different from the footfall of obese middle age, the step of a man whose active life and energetic temperament had kept him young. She met him on the threshold of the drawing-room. "I'm so glad you have come home," she said, holding up her face for his kiss. He kissed her, but without enthusiasm. "I am glad you are glad," he said, "but can that mean that you've missed me? From your letters I thought you and Lady Susan were having rather a gay time." "I was rushing about with her and going to parties, partly because I missed you." "Partly. And the other part of it was because you like parties and are dull at home, I suppose, unless you have your house full." "Oh, I am sick of it all, Mario," she said with a sort of passionate energy that made him believe her, "and I would live quite a different life if you were not away so often, and if I were not thrown too much on my own resources." "My dear Vera, this is a new development," he said gravely, sitting down beside her and looking at her with eyes that troubled her, as if they could see too much of the mind behind her face. "You are looking thin and white. Has anything happened while I've been away? Anything to make you unhappy?" "No!" she exclaimed with tremendous emphasis, for she felt as if he were going to wrest her secret from her. "What could happen? But I suppose there must come a time in every woman's life when she has had enough of what the world calls pleasure, when the charm goes out of amusements that repeat themselves year after year, and when one begins to understand the emptiness of a life occupied only with futilities, when one begins to tire of running after every new thing, actors, dancers, singers, and all the rest of them. I have had enough of that life, Mario, and I want you to help me to do something better with the liberty and the wealth you've given me." "Do you want a mission?" he asked with a faint smile. This is what women seem to want nowadays. "No, Mario, I want to be happy with you. Your business engagements take you so much away from home that our lives must be sometimes divided, but not always. We need not be always living a divided life, as we have been in the last 3 years." A crimson flush swept across her face as she spoke, remembering that these were the years in which Claude Rutherford's influence had grown from a careless comradeship to an absorbing intimacy. Her husband looked at her in silence for a few moments, and his grave smile had now a touch of irony. "Has it dawned upon you at last?" he asked. "Have you discovered that we have been living apart, that we have been man and wife in only name?" "It was not my fault, Mario. It was you who kept aloof." "Not till I saw repulsion. Not till I saw aversion." "No, no, never, never, never! I have never forgotten your goodness, never forgotten all I owe you." They had been sitting side by side on the spacious Louis XIV sofa, his hand upon her shoulder, but at her last words he started to his feet with a cry of pain. "Yes, that is it. You recognise an obligation. I have given you a fine house, fine clothes, fine friends, and you think you ought to repay me for them by pretending to love me. Vera, that is all over. There must be no more pretending. I can bear a good deal, but I cannot bear that. I told you something of my past life before we were married, but I doubt if I told you all its bitterness, all the blind egotism of my marriage, the cruel awakening from a dream of mutual love, to discover that my wife had married me because I could give her the things she wanted, and that love was out of the question. I compared myself with other men and saw the difference. And as I had missed the love of a mother, so I had to do without the love of a wife. I was not made to win a woman's love, no, not even a mother's. This was why my affection for my daughter was something more than the common love of fathers. She was the first who loved me, and she will be the last." "Mario, you are too cruel! Have I not loved you?" "Yes, perhaps for a little while, You gave me a year of infinite happiness. Our honeymoon year. That ought to be enough. I have no right to ask for more, but let there be no talk of gratitude. If I cannot have love, I will have nothing. You have been so cold, so silent and reserved, so changed. I thought you were tired of me. Tired of you? Poor child. How should you know the measureless love in the heart of a man of my life history? When I took you in my arms in the evening sunshine, I gave you all that was best and strongest in my nature, boundless love and boundless trust. All my life history went for nothing in that hour. I did not ask myself if I was the kind of man to win the heart of a girl. I did not think of my 45 years, or my forbidding face. I gave myself up to that delicious dream. I had found a girl who could love me, the divine girl, youth and innocence incarnate. Think what it was after a year of happiness to be awakened by a look, and to know that I had again been fooled. That if in the first surprise of my passionate love you'd almost loved me, that love was dead. No, no, she sobbed. And then she hid her streaming eyes upon his breast, and wound her arms about his neck, clinging to the husband in whom she found her only shelter. Was it some curious instinct of the flesh, or some power of telepathy, that told him not to take these tears and wild embrace for tokens of a wife's love? My dearest girl, he said with infinite gentleness, as he loosened the clinging arms and lifted the hidden face, if this distress means sorrow for having unwittingly deceived me, for having taken a man's heart and not been able to give him love for love, there need be no more tears. The fault was mine. The mistake was mine. You must not suffer for it. To me you will always be unspeakably sweet and dear, whether I think of you as a wife or as the girl my daughter loved, and whom I learned to love in those sad days when the shadow of death went with us in the spring sunshine. Yes, Vera, you will always be dear, my dearest on this earth, but there must be no pretending, nothing false. Think of me as your friend and protector, the one friend whom you can always trust, your rock of defence against all the dangers and delusions of a wicked world. Trust me, dearest, and never keep a secret from me. Be true to yourself. Keep your honour stainless, your purity of mind unclouded by evil associations. Let no breath of calumny soil your name. Rise, superior society chooses to ignore. I ask no more than this, my beloved girl, in return for measureless love and implicit faith. He was holding both her hands, looking at her with searching eyes, those clear grey eyes under a brow of power. Can you promise as much as this, Vera? Yes. With heart and mind? With heart and mind. And you will never take the liberty I give you for a letter of license? No, no, no! But I don't ask for liberty. I want to belong to you, to be sheltered by you. You shall have the shelter, if you need it, but be true to yourself, and you will need no defender. A woman's safest armour is her own purity. And again, my love, with a return of the slightly ironical smile, never was a woman better guarded than you are while you are fringed round by Disbrowes, protected at every point by your mother's clan, people at once well-born and well-bred, with no taint of bohemianism, unless indeed it may murk in your poco curante cousin, the young painter who made such a lamentable failure of your portrait. She felt as if every vestige of colour was fading out of her face, and that even her lips must be deadly white. They were so parched that when she tried to shape some trivial reply, the power of speech seemed gone. She felt the dry lips moving, but no sound came. This was the end of her appeal to the husband whose love might have saved her. Their relations were changed from that hour. He was not again the lover-husband of their honeymoon years, but he was no longer cold and reserved. He no longer held her at a distance. He was kind and sympathetic. He interested himself in her occupations and amusements, the books she read and the people she saw. He was with her at the opera, where Claude Rutherford sometimes came to them and sat through an act or two in the darkness at the back of the box. He was infinitely kind and tender, but it was the tenderness of a father or a benevolent uncle, rather than of a husband. He held rigidly to that which he had told her. There was to be no make-believe in their relations. If she was not happy, she was at peace for some time after her husband's homecoming, a period in which they were more together than they had ever been since those first years in their married life. She tried to be happy, tried to forget the time in which Claude Rutherford had been her daily companion, the time when she planned no pleasure that he was not to share, and had no opinions about people or places or books or art that she did not take from him, loving the things he loved, hating the things he hated, as if they had been two bodies moved by one mind. She tried not to feel an aching void for want of him. She tried not to think him cruel for coming to her house so seldom, and tried to be sorry that they met so often in the houses of her friends. The time came when the awakened conscience was lulled to sleep, and when her husband's society began to jar upon her strained nerves. She had invoked him as a defence against the enemy, and now she longed for the enemy, and had ceased to be grateful to the defender. The rampart of defence was soon to fall. A financial crisis was threatened, and Signor Provana was wanted at his office in New York. He told his wife that he might be able to come back to London in a fortnight, allowing 10 days for the double passage and 4 for his business, but if things were troublesome in America he might be a good deal longer. "I shall try to be home in time to take you to Marienbad," he told her, "but if I'm not here, Lady Okehampton will take you, and you can get Lady Susan to go with you and keep you in good spirits. I had a talk with your aunt last night, and she promised to take you under her wing." "I don't want to be under anybody's wing, and Aunt Mildred will bore me to death if I see much of her at Marienbad." "Oh, you will have your favourite Susie for amusement, and your aunt to see that she doesn't lead you into mischief. Lady Susan is a shade too adventurous for my taste." This idea of Marienbad was a new thing. A certain nervous irritability had been growing upon Vera of late, and her husband had been puzzled and uneasy, and had called in a nerve specialist recommended by Lady Okehampton, one of those new lights whom everybody believe in for a few seasons. After a quiet talk with Vera, that grave authority had suggested a rest cure, the living death of 6 weeks in a nursing home, and on this being vehemently protested against by the patient, had offered Marienbad as an alternative. Provana had been startled by this sudden change in his wife's temper, from extreme gentleness and an evident desire to please him, to a kind of febrile impatience and irritability, and remembering her curious agitation on the evening of his homecoming, her pallid cheeks and passionate tears, he had an uneasy feeling that these strange moods had a common source, and that there was something mysterious and unhappy that it was his business to discover before he left her. He came to her room early on the day of his departure, so early that she had only just left her bedroom, and was still wearing the loose white muslin gown in which she had breakfasted. She was sitting on her low sofa in a listless attitude, looking at the faces on the wall, Browning, Shelley, Byron, the faces of the inspired dead, who were more alive than the uninspired living. But at her husband's entrance she started to her feet and went to meet him. "You are not going yet?" she exclaimed. "I thought the boat train did not leave till the afternoon." "It does not, but I must give the interval to business. I have come to bid you good-bye." "I am very sorry you are obliged to go," she said. "For God's sake, do not lie to me. For pity's sake, let there be no pretending." He took both her hands and drew her to him, looking at her with an imploring earnestness. "I have trusted you as men seldom trust their wives," he said. "I thought I had done you a great wrong when I took you in the first bloom of your beauty, and made you my own, cutting you off for ever from the love of a young lover, and all the passion and romance of youth. Considering this, I tried to make amends by giving you perfect freedom to live your own life among your own friends, freedom for everything that could make a woman happy, except that romantic love which you renounced when you accepted me as your husband. I believed in you, Veera. I believed in your truth and purity as I believe in God. I could never have reconciled myself to the life we have led in this house if it were not for my invincible faith in your truth. But within this month that faith has been shaken. Your eyes have lost the old look, the lovely look through which truth shone like a light. There's something unhappy, something mysterious. There is a secret, and I must know that secret before I leave you. Her face changed to a look of stone as he watched her. It was no time for tears. It was time for a superhuman effort at repression, to hold every feeling in check, to make her nerves iron. There was defiance in her tone when she spoke, after a silence that seemed long. There is no secret. Then why are you unhappy? I am not unhappy. I have a fit of low spirits now and then, a feeling of physical depression for which there is no reason, or perhaps my idle, useless life and the luxury in which I live may be the reason. It is something more than low spirits. You are nervous and irritable, and you have a frightened look sometimes, a look that frightens me. Oh, Veera, for God's sake be frank with me. Trust me half as much as I have trusted you. Trust me as a daughter might trust her father, knowing his measureless love, and knowing that with that love there would be measureless pity. Trust me, my beloved girl. Throw your burden upon me, and you shall find the strength of a man's love and the self-abnegation that goes with it. I have no secret, no mystery. I mean to be worthy of your trust. I mean to be true to myself. If you doubt me, let me go to America with you. Keep me with you. His face lighted as she spoke, and then he looked thoughtfully at the fragile form, the delicate features, the ethereal beauty that seemed to have so frail a hold on life. No, you are not the stuff for sea voyages, and the storm and stress of New York. If we went there together, I should have to leave you too much alone among strangers. I shall have an anxious time there, but it shall not be a long time. If possible, I shall be here to take you to Marienbad, and in the meantime you must live quietly and do what your doctor tells you. He is to see you next week, remember. He held her to his heart with stronger feeling than he had shown for a long time, and gave her his goodbye kiss. She flung herself on her knees as the door closed behind him. God, help me to be true to him in heart and mind. That was the prayer she breathed mutely, while her tears fell thick and fast upon her clasped hands. He was gone, the unloved husband, and she had to face the peril of the undeclared lover. She felt helpless and forsaken, and she sat for a long time in listless misery, and then, looking up at the pictures on the wall, she tried to realize that silent companionship, the souls of the illustrious dead, tried to believe that she was not alone in her dejection, that in the silence of her lonely room there was the sympathy and understanding of souls over whom death has no more dominion, and whose pity was more profound than any earth-bound creature could give her. She thought of Francis Simeon, and of those meetings of which he had told her. Nothing had come of her interview with him. Claude Rutherford's light laughter had blown away her belief in the high priest of the spiritual world, and she had thought no more of the creed that had appealed so strongly to her imagination. Now, when life seemed a barren waste, her thoughts turned to the philosophic visionary who had so gravely expounded his dream. Everything in her material world harassed and distressed her, and she had turned to the spiritual life to escape from reality. She wrote urgently to Mr. Simeon, telling him that she was unhappy, and asking to be admitted to the society of which he had told her. She had not to wait long for an answer. Simeon called upon her that afternoon, and was with her for more than an hour, full of kindness and sympathy that scared her, for it seemed as if those strange eyes must be reading the depths of her inner consciousness, and all the disgust of life and vague longing that were interwoven with her thoughts of Claude Rutherford. It was to escape those thoughts, to dissever herself from that haunting image that she pleaded for admission to the shadow world. Bring me in communion with the great minds that are above earthly passions, would be her prayer, could she have spoken freely. But she sat in a thoughtful silence, soothed by the spiritualist exposition of that dream world, which was to him more real than the solid earth upon which he had to live, a reluctant participator in the life of the vulgar herd. The mass of mankind who have no joys that are not sensual, and who live only in the present moment, have nothing but ridicule and disbelief for the faith that makes even this sordid material world beautiful for us, who see in earthly things the image of things supernal. He said, with that accent of sincerity, that intense conviction which had made scoffers cease from scoffing under the influence of his personality, however they might ridicule him in his absence. Everyone had to admit that, though the creed might be absurd, the man was wonderful. There was to be a meeting of us at his chambers on the following afternoon, and Simeon begged Veera to come. You may find only thought and silence, he said, a company of friends absorbed in meditation, but without any message from the other world, or you may hear words that burn, the voices of disembodied genius. In any case, while you are with us, you will be away from the dust and traffic of the material world. Yes, she would go. She was only too glad to be allowed to be among his disciples. I want to escape, she told him. I am tired of my futile life. So tired. I thought you would have joined us long ago, he said as he took leave, but I think I know the influence that held you back. The hot blood rushed into her face, the red fire of conscious guilt that always came at the thought of Claude Rutherford. She had never minimized her sin. It was sin to have made him essential to her happiness, to have lost interest in all the rest of her life, to have given him her heart and mind. I think the psychological moment has come, continued Simeon's slow, grave voice, and that you should now become one of us. You have drained the cup of this trivial life and have found its bitterness. Our religion is our faith in the afterlife. We have the faith that looks through death. The orthodox Christian talks of the life beyond, and we must give him credit for sometimes thinking of it. But does he realize it? Is it near him? Does he look through death to the spirit world beyond? Does he realize the afterlife as Christ realized it when he talked with his disciples? End of chapter 8, part 2. Recording by Sarah in Brighton.
Chapter 9 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 9. The meeting in Mr. Simeon's library lasted all through the summer afternoon, till the edge of evening. The large and gloomy room was darkened by Venetian shutters, nearly closed over open windows. There was air and the ceaseless sound of traffic, but the summer sun was excluded, and figures were seen dimly, as if they belonged to the shadow world. Among those indistinct forms, Vera recognised people she knew, people she would never have expected to find in a society of mystics. A statesman, a poet, 3 popular novelists, and 6 of the idlest women of her acquaintance, 2 of whom were the heroines of romantic stories, women over whose future friends watched and prophesied with the keen interest that centres in a domestic situation where catastrophe seems imminent. Vera wondered, seeing these 2, had they come, like her, for a refuge from the tragedy of life? They had not come for an escape from sin, for, if their friends were to be believed, the borderline had been passed long ago. An hour of silence, broken now and then by deep breathing, as of agitation, and sometimes by a stifled sob, and then a flood of words, speech that was eloquent enough to seem inspired, speech that might have come from him who wrote Christmas Eve, and Easter Day, and A Death in the Desert, the speech of a believer in all that is most divine in the promise of a future life. And after that burst of impassioned utterance there were other speakers, men and women, the men strong in faith, strong in the gift of tongues, possessed by the higher mind that spoke through organs of common clay, the women semi-hysterical, romantic, eloquent with remembered poetry. But in men and women alike there was sincerity, an intense belief in that close contact of disembodied mind, sincerity that carried conviction to an imaginative neophyte like Vera Provana. Suddenly, from the stillness there came a voice more thrilling than any Vera had heard in that long séance, a voice that was not altogether unfamiliar, but with a note more intense, more poignant than she knew. Gleaming through the shadows, she saw eyes that flashed green light, and a long thin face of marble pallor, in which she knew the face of Lady Fanny Ransom. And now came the most startling speech that had been heard that afternoon, the passionate advocacy of free love, love released from the dominion of law, the bonds of custom, the fear of the world, love as in Shelley's wildest dreams, but more transcendental than in the dreams of poets, the love of spirit for spirit, soul for soul, pure to pure, as Milton imagined the love of angels. All the grossness of earth was eliminated from that rarefied atmosphere in which Francis Simeon's disciples had their being. Their first and indispensable qualification was to have liberated thought and feeling from the dominion of the senses. While still wearing the husk of the flesh, they were to be spirits, and not till they had become spirits were they capable of communion with those radiant beings whose earthly vesture had been annihilated by death. To Vera there was an awful beauty in those echoes of great minds, and her faith was strong in the belief that among this little company of aspiring mortals there hovered the spirits of the illustrious dead. She left Mr. Simeon's room with those others, who dispersed in absolute silence, as good people leave a church, with no recognition of each other, stealing away as from a service of unusual solemnity. They did not even look at each other, nor did they take leave of Mr. Simeon, who stood by one of the shuttered windows, gravely watching as his guests departed. 'Twas past 7, and the sun was low, as Vera went to her carriage, which was waiting for her in Burlington Gardens. She was stepping into it when a too familiar voice startled her. She had been too deep in thought to see Claude Rutherford waiting for her at the gate of the Albany. "Send your carriage home, Vera, and walk through the Green Park with me. You must want fresh air after the gloom of Simeon's Egyptian temple." No, I'm going straight home." "Indeed you are not." And without further argument he took upon himself to give the order to the footman. "Your mistress will walk home." She would have resisted, but it was not easy to dispute with a man who had a way of taking things for granted, especially those things he wanted. It would have been easier to contend against energy, or even brute force, than against that nonchalant self-assurance of an amiable idler, who sauntered through life, getting his own way by a passive resistance of all opposing circumstances. "I have been waiting nearly 2 hours," he said. "It would be hard if you couldn't give me half an hour before your dinner. I know you never dine before 8:30. "But I have to be punctual. Aunt Mildred is coming to dinner, and Susie Amphlett." "It has only just struck 7. You shall be home before 8, and I suppose you can dress in half an hour." "I won't risk not being in the drawing-room when Aunt Mildred comes." "Lady Okehampton is a terror, I admit. You shall be home in good time, child, but I must have something for my 2 hours." "How absurd of you to wait," she said lightly. "And how did you know I was at Mr. Symeon's?" They were going through the Albany to Piccadilly. She had recovered from the shock of his appearance, and was able to speak with the old trivial air, the tone of comradeship, an easy friendliness, without the possibility of deeper feeling. It had seemed so natural before the consciousness of sin, and it had been so sweet. This evening, as she walked by his side, she began to think that they might still be comrades and friends without the shadow of fear, that her agony of awakened conscience had been foolish and hysterical, imaginary sin, like the self-accusation of some demented nun. "How did I know? Well, after calling at your house repeatedly, only to be told you were not at home, I lost my temper and determined to find out where you were, at least for this one afternoon, when I knew of no high jinks in the houses of your friends, and so, having asked an impertinent question or two of your butler, I found that Symeon had been with you yesterday, and guessed that you might be at his occult assembly this afternoon. I had heard a whisper of such an assembly more than a week ago, so you see the process of discovery was not difficult." "But why take so much trouble?" "Why? Because you have treated me very badly, and I don't mean to put up with that kind of treatment. If it comes to why, I have my own why to ask, a why that I must have answered. What ignorant sin have I committed that it should be Darwaza banned when I call in Portland Place? What has become of our cousinship, our memory of childish pleasures, the sea, the woods, the heather, the pony that ran away with you while I stood with my blood frozen, telling myself, 'If he kills her, I shall throw myself over the cliff'? What has become of our past, Vera? Is blood to be no thicker than water? Is the bond of our childish affection to go for nothing? Is it because I am a failure that you have cut me?" "I have not cut you, Claude. How can you say such a thing?" "Have you not? Then I know nothing of the cutting process. To be always out when I call, to take infinite trouble to avoid me when we meet in other people's houses. The cut direct was never more stony-hearted and remorseless." "You must not fancy things," she said lightly. They were in the Green Park by this time, the quiet Green Park, whence nursemaids and children had vanished, and where even loafers were few at this hour between afternoon and evening. She spoke lightly, and there was a lightness at her heart that was new. It was sweet to be with him, sweet to be walking at his side on the old familiar terms, friends, companions, comrades, as of old. His careless speech, his supreme ease of manner, seemed to have broken a spell. She looked back and thought of her troubled conscience, and all the scheming and distress of the last 2 months, and she felt as if she had awakened from a fever dream, from a dreary interval of delirium and hysteria. What danger could there be in such a friendship? What had tragedy to do with Claude Rutherford? This airy trifler, this saunterer through life, was not of the stuff of which lovers are made. He was a man whom all women liked, but he was not the man whom a woman calls her fate, and who cannot be her friend without being her destroyer. How could she ever have feared him? He was of her own blood. His respect for her race, the race to which he belonged, would hold him in check, even if there were no other restraining influences. the burden of fear was lifted, and her spirits rose to a girlish lightness as she walked by her cousin's side with swift footsteps, listening to his playful reproaches, his facetious bewailing of his worthlessness. From this time forward she would treat him as a brother. She would never again think it possible that words of love, unholy words, could fall from his lips. No such word had ever been spoken, and was it not shameful in her to have feared him, to imagine him a lover, while he had always shown himself her loyal kinsman? In this new and happy hour she forgot that it was her own heart that had sounded the alarm, that it was because she loved him, not because he loved her, that she had resolved upon ruling him out of her life. Perhaps this evening, after the glamour of Mr. Symeon's assembly, she was fey. This sudden rush of gladness, this ecstasy of reunion with the friend from whom she had compassed heaven and earth to hold herself aloof, seemed more than the gladness of common day. She trod on air, and when they pulled up suddenly at Hyde Park Corner, it was a surprise to find that they had not been walking towards Portland Place. "We must make for Stanhope Gate and cross Grosvenor Square and Bond Street," Claude said gaily. "We have come a long way round, but a walk is a walk, and I have no doubt we both wanted one. Perhaps you would prefer a cab?" "No, I like walking, if there is time." "Plenty of time. You walk like Atalanta, if that young person ever condescended to anything but a run." "Do you remember our walks in the woods, and the afternoon we lost our way and could not get home for the nursery tea?" "You mean when I lost my way, and you had to tramp the shoes off your dear little feet? Brave little minx, I shall never forget how plucky you were, and how you kept back the tears when your lips quivered with pain." Once launched upon reminiscences of that golden summer, there was no gap in their talk till the lions' heads were frowning at them on the threshold of Vera's home. She was flushed with her walk, and the colour in cheeks that were generally pale gave a new brightness to her eyes. That long talk of her childish days had taken her out of her present life. She was a child again, happy in the present moment, without the wisdom that looks before and after. "Good-bye," said Claude, and then, pausing with his hand on the moody lion, "if you had some vague idea of asking me to dinner, it would be a kindness to give shape to the notion, for I shan't get a dinner anywhere else. My mother is in the country, and a solitary meal at a restaurant is worse than a funeral." Vera hesitated, with a faint blush, not being able utterly to forget her determination to keep Claude Rutherford out of her daily life. "Lady Okehampton expects to find me alone," she said. "But you have Susie Amphlett." "Susie invited herself." "As I am doing. 3 women. What a funereal feast. As bad as Domitian's black banquet. Your aunt dotes upon me, and so does Susan. You will score by having secured me. You can say I threw over a long engagement for the sake of meeting them. I dare say there is some solemn dinner invitation stuck in my chimney glass. I often forget such things." The doors were flung open, and the suave man in black and his liveried lieutenants awaited their mistress's entrance. "À ce soir," said Claude, as he hailed a prowling hansom, and he was seated in it, smiling at her with lifted hat, before Vera had time to answer him. "Mr. Rutherford will dine here this evening," she told the butler. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 10. Vera was walking up and down her drawing-room at 20 minutes past 8, dressed in one of those filmy white evening gowns with which her wardrobe was always supplied, one of her mermaid frocks, as Lady Susan called them. This one was all gauzy whiteness, with something green and glittering that flashed out of the whiteness now and then to match the emerald circlet in her cloudy hair. The tender carnation that had come from her walk was still in her cheeks, still giving unusual brightness to her eyes. She had been happy. She had put away dark thoughts. Life was gay and glad once again, glad and gay as it had always been when she and Claude were together. A load had been lifted from her heart, the vulgar terror of the conventional wife, who could not imagine friendship without sin. The things that she had heard that afternoon had given a new meaning to life, had lifted her thoughts and feelings from the commonplace to the transcendental, to the sphere in which there was no such thing as sin, where there was only darkness and light, where the senses had no power over the soul that dwelt in communion with souls released from earth. She no longer feared a lover in the friend she had chosen out of the common herd. Lady Okehampton sailed into the drawing-room as the silvery chime of an Italian clock told the half-hour. Her expansive person, clad in amber satin, glowed like the setting sun, and her smiling face radiated good nature. She put up her long glass to look at Vera, being somewhat short-sighted physically as well as morally. "My dear child, you are looking worlds better than when I last saw you. You were such a wreck at Lady Mohun's ball. Looked as if you ought to have been in bed, doing a rest cure. A ghost in a diamond tiara. I find that when a woman is looking ill, diamonds always make her look worse. But tonight you are charming. That emerald bandeau suits you better than the thing you wore at the ball. You haven't the aquiline profile that can carry off an all-round crown." Claude and Lady Susan came in together. "My car nearly collided with his taxi," said Lady Susie, when she had embraced her friend. "But I was very glad to see a man at your door. From what you said this morning, I expected a hen party. Now, a big hen party is capital fun, but for 3 women to sit at meat alone, the idea opens an immeasurable vista of boredom. I always feel as if I must draw the butler into the conversation, and bandy an occasional joke with the footman. No doubt they could be immensely funny if one would let them." "It was an afterthought," said Claude. "Vera took fright at the 11th hour and admitted the serpent into her paradise." "No doubt Adam and Eve were dull. A perpetual tete-a-tete, tempered by tame lions, must soon have palled, but at least it was better than 3 women yawning in each other's faces after exhausting the latest scandal." "I think the early dinner in Paradise Lost quite the dullest meal on record," said Claude. "To begin with, it was vegetarian and non-alcoholic. A man and his wife, the wife waiting at table, and one prosy guest monologuing from the eggs to the apples. There is no mention of eggs. I don't think they had anything so comfortable as a poultry yard in Eden. No Buff Orpingtons, or White Wyandottes. Only eagles and nightingales," said Susie. And at this moment the butler announced dinner in a confidential murmur, as if it were a state secret. He was neither stout nor elderly, but in his tall slimness and grave countenance there was a dignity that would have reduced the most emancipated of matrons to good behaviour. "I should never dare to draw him into the conversation," whispered Susie, as Claude offered his arm to Lady Okehampton. "Nothing would tempt that perfect creature to a breach of etiquette." The hen dinner, relieved by one man, was charming. Not too long a dinner, for one of the discoveries of this easy-going century is that people don't want to sit for an hour and a half, steeping themselves in the savour of expensive food, while solemn men in plush and silk stockings stalk behind their back in an endless procession, carrying dishes whose contents are coldly glanced at and coldly refused. The dinner was short, but perfect. Too short for the talk, which was gay and animated from start to finish. Lady Susan and Mr. Rutherford were the talkers, Vera and her aunt only coming in occasionally. Lady Okehampton with a comfortable common sense that was meant to keep the rodomontade within bounds. Claude was an omnivorous reader, and had always a new set of anecdotes and epigrams with which to keep the talk alive. Anecdotes so brief and sparkling that he seemed to flash them across the table like pistol shots. French, German, or Italian, his accent was faultless, and his enunciation clear as that of the most finished comedian, while in the give and take of friendly chaff with such an interlocutor as Lady Susan, he was a past master. Vera did not talk much, but she looked radiant, the lovely embodiment of youth and gladness. Her light laughter rang clear above Susan's, after Claude's most successful stories. Only once during that gay repast was a graver note sounded, and it came from the most frivolous of the party, from Susie Amphlett, who had one particular aversion, which she sometimes enlarged upon with a morbid interest. Age was Susan's bugbear. "I think of it when I wake in the night, like Camilla in Great Expectations," she said, looking round the table with frightened eyes, as if she were seeing ghosts. The grapes and peaches had been handed, and it was the confidential quarter of an hour after the servants had gone. "I don't like to give myself away before a butler," Susie said, as the door closed on the last of the silk stockings. "Footmen are non-existent. One doesn't stop to consider whether they are matter or only electricity. But a butler is a person and can think. Perhaps a socialistic satirist, seething with silent scorn for his mistress and her friends." "And no doubt an esteemed contributor to one of the society papers," said Claude. "I'm not afraid of democracy, nor the English adaptation of the French Revolution, though I feel sure it is coming," continued Lady Susan, planting her elbow on the table in an expansive mood. "I am afraid of nothing except growing old. That one terror swallows up all trivial fears. They might take my money, they might steep me in poverty to the lips, and if I could keep youth and good looks, I should hardly mind." Again she looked at the others appealingly, like a child that is afraid of Red Riding Hood's wolf. "Age is such a hideous disease, the one incurable malady, and we must all have it. We are all growing old, even you, Vera, though you have not begun to think about it. I didn't till I was 30. As we sit at this table and laugh and amuse ourselves, the sands are falling, falling, falling. They never stop. Glad or sorry, that horrible disease goes on, till the symptoms suddenly become acute. Grey hair, wrinkles, gout." "But are there not some mild pleasures left in the years that bring the philosophic mind?" asked Claude. "Does that mean when one is 80? At 80 one might easily be philosophic. Everything would be over and done with. One would be like old Lord Trawley, who said he was dead, though people did not know it." "Some of the most delightful people I have known were old, and even very old," said Claude, "but they didn't mind. That's the secret of eternal youth, my dear Susie, not to mind. To wear the best wig you can buy, and not to pretend it is your own hair. To wear pretty clothes, especially suited to your years, sumptuous velvet and more sumptuous fur, like a portrait of an old lady by Velasquez. Never to brag of your age, but never to be ashamed of it. The last phase may be the best phase, if one has the philosophic mind." "Oh, you!" exclaimed Susan scornfully. "You are like Chesterfield. You will have your good manners till your last deathbed visitor has been given a chair, A fine manner is the only thing that time can't touch." Vera saw her aunt looking bored, and smiled the signal for moving. "Half a cigarette and I shall follow," said Claude as he opened the door for the trio, "unless I am distinctly forbidden." "Why should we forbid you? You are an artist, and you know more about frocks and hats than we do, after years of laborious study," said Lady Susan, and then, with her arm through Vera's, as they went slowly up the broad staircase, with steps so shallow that people accustomed to small houses were in danger of falling over them. "Isn't he incomparable?" she exclaimed. "There never was such a delightful failure." "Poor Claude," sighed Lady Okehampton. "I suppose it is only the men who fail in everything who have time to be agreeable. If a young man has a great ambition and is thinking of his career, he is generally a bear. Claude has wasted all his chances in life and can afford to waste his time." "It was a pity he left the army," said Susan. "He looked lovely in his uniform. I remember him as he flashed past me in a hansom one summer morning after a levee, a vision of beauty." "It was a pity he got himself entrapped by a bad woman," said Lady Okehampton with a sigh. "His Colonel's second wife," put in Lady Susan. "Isn't it always the elderly Colonel's second wife?" Lady Okehampton gave another sigh. "It was a disgraceful story," she murmured. "Let us try to forget all about it." Vera had flushed and paled while they were talking. "But tell me about it, Aunt Mildred," she said, with a kind of angry eagerness. "Where was the disgrace? More than in all such cases? A wicked woman? A foolish young man? Very young, wasn't he?" "Not 25. "Where was the disgrace?" "Don't excite yourself, child. Duplicity, an old man's heart broken. Isn't that enough? An elopement or not an elopement. Something horrid that happened after a regimental ball. I know nothing of the details, for it all took place while the regiment was in India, which only shows that Kipling's stories are true to life. The husband would not divorce her, which was a blessing, or Claude would have had to marry her. He spoilt his career by the intrigue, but marriage would have been worse." Vera's heart was beating violently when Claude sauntered into the room presently, and made his leisurely way to the sofa where she was sitting aloof from the other two, who had just entered upon an animated discussion of the last fashionable nerve specialist and his methods. "What has made you so pale?" Claude asked, as he seated himself by Vera's side. "Was our walk through the streets too much for you? I should never forgive myself if—" "You have nothing to be sorry for. The walk was delightful. My aunt and Susie have been talking of unpleasant things." "What kind of things?" "Of your leaving the army. You have never told me why you threw up your career." "My career? There was not much to lose. The Boer War was over. My regiment was in India all the time, and I never had a look in." "Oh, they have been telling you an ugly story about your poor friend, and it will be 'The door is shut' again, I suppose." "Why did you not tell me of your past life? I have told you everything about mine." "Because you had only nice, innocent things to tell. My story would not bear telling, and why should you want to know?" "There should not be a wall between friends, such friends as we have been, like brother and sister." "Do brothers tell old love stories? Stale, barren stories of loves that are dead?" "Perhaps not. I oughtn't to have spoken about it. Come and talk to Aunt Mildred. Her carriage has been announced, and she'll be huffed if we don't go to her." Claude followed meekly, and in 5 minutes Lady Okehampton had forgotten that it was 11 o'clock, and that her horses had been waiting half an hour. He had a curious power of making women pleased with themselves, and with him. He always flattered them, but his flattery was so discreet and subtle as to be imperceptible. It was rather his evident delight in being with them and talking to them that pleased, than anything that he said. "Come to Rivermead for next Sunday. It will be my last week-end party before we go to Scotland," Lady Okehampton said to him before she bade good night. "Vera and Susan are coming. We shall be a small party, and there will be plenty of bridge." Claude accepted the invitation as he took Lady Okehampton to her carriage. "I wish Provana was not so much away from his wife," she said. "It is a very difficult position for Vera." "Vera is not la première venue. She knows how to take care of herself." "That's what they always say about women. But is it true in her case? She is very young, and rather simple, and knows very little of the world." "Not after 6 years as the wife of a financial Croesus," murmured Claude, while he arranged the matron's voluminous mantle over her shoulders as carefully as if the outside atmosphere had been arctic. He knew that the drift of her speech had been by way of warning for him. Dear inconsistent soul! It was so like her to invite him to spend 3 days with her niece in the Saint-Gêne of a riverside villa, and 5 minutes afterwards to sound a note of warning. He walked along the lamplit streets with the light foot of triumphant love. Vera's pale distress and unwise questioning had set his heart beating with the presage of victory. Poor child! For his acute perceptions, the heart of a woman had seldom been a mystery, and this woman's heart was easier to read than most. Poor child! She had been trying to live without him. She had fought her poor little battle with more of resolution and of courage than he would have expected from a creature so tender. She had kept him out of her life for a long time that had seemed an eternity for him in his longing for her, and then, at a word, at a smile, at the touch of his hand, she had yielded, and had let him see that to be with him was to be happy, and that nothing else mattered. Light love had been his portion in the light years of youth, but this was no light love. He had sacrificed his career for the sake of a woman, but the sacrifice had been forced upon him, and it had killed his love. But now he was prepared for any sacrifice, for the sacrifice of lifelong exile and strained means. He thought of a home in a summer isle of the great southern ocean, like Stevenson's, or, if gaiety were better, in some romantic city of Spanish America. There were paradises enough in the world. There would be no one to point the finger of scorn where society was a word of no meaning. He would carry his love to the world's end, beyond the reach of shame. Nothing mattered but Vera. Yes, there was one who mattered, his mother. But tonight he could not even think of her, or if he thought of her, it was to tell himself that if Provana divorced his wife, and he and Vera were married, his mother would be reconciled to the inevitable. Her religion would be a stumbling block. To her mind, such a marriage would be no marriage. Tonight he could not reason. He would not see obstacles in his path. Vera's pale looks and anxious questions had been a confession of love, a forecast of surrender, and in the tumult of his thoughts there was no room for hesitation or for fear. He thought of his love now as duty. It was his duty to rescue this dear girl from a loveless union with a hard man of business, old enough to be her father, from splendours and luxuries that had become as dust and ashes. He had known for a long time that she cared for him, but he had never reckoned the strength of her attachment. Only this afternoon, in her radiant happiness, as they walked through the unromantic streets, only in her pale distress tonight, as she questioned him, had he discovered his power. And now there seemed to be but one possible issue, a new life for them both. His mother's absence from London was an inexpressible relief to him. How could he have met the tender questioning of the eyes that watched over his life, and had learned how to read his mind from the time when thought began? How could he have hidden the leaping, passionate thoughts, the sense of a crisis in his fate, the ardent expectation, the dream of joy, the fever and excitement in the mind of a man who is making his plan of a new life, a life of exquisite happiness? End of chapter 10.